The autumn evening settled over Hogwarts like a heavy wool blanket, muffling the usual sounds of student chatter and footsteps in the corridors. Most first years were safely tucked away in their common rooms by now, comparing notes on the day's lessons or writing letters home. The library stood nearly empty, save for the occasional seventh year cramming for advanced examinations and the ever-watchful presence of Madame Pince, who prowled between the stacks like a protective hawk, guarding her precious charges. Deep within the ancient runes section, where dust motes danced in the amber glow of floating candles, and the air carried the comforting scent of aged parchment and worn leather bindings, Harry Potter sat hunched over a table that hadn't seen visitors in weeks. His small frame seemed even smaller, surrounded by towering shelves that stretched toward the vaulted ceiling, their contents representing centuries of magical knowledge that felt impossibly vast and intimidating to an 11-year-old boy who had only learned of magic's existence 2 months prior. The letter lay open before him on the dark wood surface, its harsh words seeming to burn themselves into his vision no matter how many times he tried to look away. Vernon Dursley's crude handwriting sprawled across the cheap paper like angry scars, each word carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. "Boy," it began, because even in correspondence, his uncle refused to acknowledge Harry's name. "The headmaster fellow sent word that you're settling in fine at that freak school of yours. Don't get any ideas about coming back here, acting like you're special. You're still the same worthless burden you've always been, and a few magic tricks won't change that. We've told the neighbors you're at a special school for troubled children, which isn't far from the truth. Don't write again unless there's an emergency. We have better things to do than read about your freakish activities." Harry's hands trembled as he folded the letter, the paper crinkling loudly in the library's profound silence. 3 weeks. It had taken him 3 weeks of careful observation, of watching other students eagerly tear open letters from home during breakfast, of seeing their faces light up with joy or concern or simple human connection, before he'd finally worked up the courage to send his own tentative correspondence to Privet Drive. The letter had been pathetically hopeful, filled with wonder about moving staircases and talking portraits, about making friends and learning magic. He'd spent hours crafting it, wanting desperately to share his amazement with someone, anyone, who might care about his experiences. The response had arrived that very evening. A sob caught in his throat, and Harry pressed his fist against his mouth to muffle the sound. He couldn't cry here. Someone might hear, might see, might realize just how utterly alone he truly was. The thought of pity from his classmates felt almost worse than their indifference. At least when they ignored him, he could pretend it was simply because he was new, unremarkable, forgettable. If they discovered the truth about his desperate hunger for even the smallest scrap of affection, the most basic acknowledgement of his existence, he wasn't sure he could bear their looks of sympathy or disgust. But the tears came anyway, hot and bitter and unstoppable. They fell onto the ancient wooden table, joining countless others shed by students over the decades who had sought solace in the library's quiet corners. Harry buried his face in his arms, his shoulders shaking with the effort of keeping his grief silent. The sound of his ragged breathing seemed to echo off the surrounding books, each volume a witness to his breakdown. He thought about Ron and Seamus back in the dormitory, probably laughing about something ridiculous Dean had said during dinner. They were kind enough boys, friendly in the casual way of children who had never known real want or abandonment. But their friendship felt surface level, built on shared experiences that Harry couldn't relate to, conversations about families and holidays, and childhood memories that highlighted just how different his upbringing had been. They included him when they remembered to, invited him to join their games and adventures with the thoughtless generosity of those who had never questioned their own worth. But they didn't need him. Not really. They had grown up with love, with parents who celebrated their achievements and comforted their disappointments. They wrote letters home, filled with ordinary complaints about homework, and received packages of sweets and encouraging words in return. The easy confidence that came from knowing you were wanted, valued, cherished, radiated from them like warmth from a hearth fire. Harry had never felt that warmth. The Dursleys had made their feelings crystal clear from his earliest memories. He was an unwelcome obligation, a burden to be endured rather than a child to be cherished. Every day had been a lesson in his own worthlessness, every harsh word and casual cruelty designed to reinforce his place as an outsider in his own home. The cupboard under the stairs hadn't just been his bedroom, it had been a physical manifestation of how little space he was allowed to occupy in the world. Coming to Hogwarts had felt like stepping into a dream, a place where magic was real and anything seemed possible. For a few precious weeks, he'd allowed himself to hope that maybe finally he'd found somewhere he belonged. The wonder of learning magic, the ancient halls filled with mystery and possibility, the chance to reinvent himself away from the Dursleys' crushing expectations, it had all seemed too good to be true. And perhaps it was. The letter proved that nothing had really changed. He was still the same unwanted boy, still the freak who didn't deserve love or kindness. Magic might flow through his veins, and ancient wizards might know his name, but the fundamental truth of his existence remained unchanged. He was alone. He had always been alone. He would always be alone. A soft footstep interrupted his spiral of despair, followed by the gentle rustle of robes against stone. Harry's head snapped up, eyes wide with panic as he frantically tried to wipe away the evidence of his tears. His face burned with shame as he prepared to face whoever had discovered him in this pathetic state, already formulating excuses about allergies or dust from the old books. Hermione Granger stood at the end of his table, her arms full of thick volumes on transfiguration theory, her usually neat hair slightly dishevelled from hours of study. Her brown eyes, sharp with intelligence and typically bright with enthusiasm for learning, now held something softer, more careful. She had clearly been here for some time, probably researching in the next section over, and the sound of his muffled crying had drawn her attention. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Harry felt exposed, vulnerable, caught in his lowest moment by the one person whose opinion of him he had come to value despite their limited interactions. Hermione was brilliant, obviously so, with a quick wit and thorough knowledge that left even their professors impressed. She was also, Harry had observed, profoundly lonely in her own way, isolated by her exceptional abilities and Muggle background in a world that seemed to prize either pure blood status or casual mediocrity over genuine excellence. She set her books down carefully on the table, the soft thud breaking the heavy silence between them. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry to the front desk where Madame Pince held court over her domain. "Is everything all right, Harry?" she asked, and the genuine concern in her voice nearly undid him completely. There was no pity there, no condescension, just simple human kindness from someone who recognized distress when she saw it. Harry opened his mouth to lie, to offer some casual dismissal that would preserve what remained of his dignity. The words caught in his throat, tangled up with fresh tears and the crushing weight of his isolation. Instead, he found himself shaking his head, unable to meet her eyes. Hermione moved around the table without hesitation, settling into the chair beside him, rather than across from him, a choice that somehow felt significant. The gesture placed them on equal footing, allies rather than interrogator and subject. She didn't reach for him, or offer empty platitudes, simply made herself available in case he wanted to talk. The kindness of it, the simple recognition of his pain without judgment or demands, cracked something deep inside Harry's chest. The words began to flow then, halting at first, then gaining momentum as months of suppressed loneliness came pouring out. He told her about the letter, about the Dursleys, about growing up in a cupboard and being called freak and never ever being wanted by anyone. He spoke about birthdays forgotten and Christmases spent alone while his cousin was showered with presents, about dinners withheld as punishment for accidental magic he couldn't control or understand, about years of being told he was worthless, unwanted, a burden that decent people shouldn't have to bear. The words tumbled out in a desperate rush, as if he was afraid that stopping would mean losing the courage to continue. Hermione listened without interrupting, her face growing increasingly pale as the scope of his childhood neglect became clear. When he mentioned the cupboard, her hands clenched into fists on the table. When he described being locked away whenever the Dursleys had guests, her breathing grew sharp and angry. But she didn't interrupt, didn't try to minimize his pain with reassurances that things weren't so bad, or that he should be grateful for having a home at all. When Harry finally ran out of words, when the last of his shameful secrets had been laid bare between them, the silence that followed felt different than before. Cleaner, somehow, like lancing an infected wound that had been poisoning his system for years. "I'm sorry," Hermione said finally, and the words carried a weight that suggested she understood exactly what she was apologizing for. Not just the immediate pain, but the years of accumulated damage, the fundamental violation of a child's trust in the world around them. Harry risked a glance at her face and found no pity there, only a fierce anger that wasn't directed at him. Her brown eyes blazed with indignation on his behalf, and something in his chest loosened at the sight. Someone was angry for him. Someone thought he deserved better. "You don't have to be sorry," he mumbled, falling back into old patterns of minimizing his own pain. "It's not that bad, really. They fed me and gave me a place to sleep." "Harry Potter," Hermione said sharply, and her tone made him look up in surprise. "That's not love. That's not even basic human decency. You were a child in their care, and they failed you in every possible way. Don't you dare apologize for their cruelty or pretend it was acceptable." The fierce protectiveness in her voice stunned him. No one had ever defended him before. No one had ever been angry on his behalf. The Dursleys had trained him so thoroughly to accept their treatment as normal, as deserved, that hearing someone call it what it truly was felt revolutionary. "But they're the only family I have," Harry whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted him through every miserable day at Privet Drive. "If they don't want me, then no one does." Hermione was quiet for a long moment, and Harry could practically see her brilliant mind working through everything he'd told her. When she spoke again, her words were measured but intense, carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "That's not true," she said firmly. "Family isn't just about blood, Harry. It's about people who choose to care about you, who want you to be happy and safe and successful. The Dursleys may be your relatives, but they've never been your family. They've never earned that title." She paused, seeming to gather her courage for something significant. Then she reached across the table and took his hands in hers, her grip warm and steady and real. "I know we haven't been friends for very long," she continued, her voice dropping to that same careful whisper. "And I know I'm not the most popular person in our year. I'm too intense, too eager, too different from what people expect. But Harry, if you'll let me, I'd like to be your friend. Your real friend. Not just someone you sit near in class or share a dormitory with." Harry stared at their joined hands, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. Hope, fragile and terrifying, began to unfurl in his chest. "I promise you this," Hermione said, and her words carried the solemnity of an oath. "I will never leave your side. Not by choice. You'll never have to face anything alone again, not if I can help it. Whatever comes, whatever happens, you'll have at least one person in this world who wants you around, who thinks you're worth knowing and caring about." The tears came again then, but they felt different this time, cleaner, less like drowning, and more like finally coming up for air after being underwater for far too long. Harry squeezed Hermione's hands, hardly able to speak, around the emotion clogging his throat. "Why?" he managed finally. "Why would you want to be my friend? I'm nobody special. I don't even know how to be a proper wizard yet." Hermione smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her since she'd found him crying. It transformed her face completely, chasing away the serious intensity that usually marked her features and revealing the girl beneath the formidable intellect. "Because you're kind," she said simply. "Because when Neville lost his remembrall and was too scared to look for it, you helped him search, even though it meant being late for your own class. Because you always say please and thank you to the house elves, even when no one else bothers. Because you listen when people talk to you, really listen, instead of just waiting for your turn to speak." She paused, her grip on his hands tightening slightly. "And because you're braver than you know," she continued, "you lived through years of cruelty and came out of it still wanting to be good to others. That's not a nothing, Harry. That's extraordinary." Harry felt something shift inside him, some fundamental piece of his worldview clicking into place. For the first time in his life, someone saw value in him that had nothing to do with his fame or his supposed destiny. Hermione liked him for who he was, not who he was supposed to become. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "Being friends, I mean. Real friends." "Then it's settled," Hermione declared with satisfaction. "We'll be a team. Study partners, homework allies, fellow book enthusiasts, and most importantly, people who look out for each other." She released his hands to dig around in her bag, producing a clean handkerchief that she offered him with matter-of-fact kindness. Harry accepted it gratefully, wiping away the last traces of his tears and feeling lighter than he had in weeks. "Now," Hermione said, her tone shifting into something more business-like, but no less warm. "Let's make some practical plans. First, we need to establish a communication system, so you never have to wait weeks wondering if anyone cares about you. I'll write to you every day if necessary. Second, we're going to create a study schedule that plays to both our strengths. I'll help you with theory and research. You can help me with practical application and intuitive magic." "Third," she continued, and her voice grew hard with determination, "we're going to figure out a way to get you away from those people permanently. There have to be laws, magical or muggle, that protect children from that kind of treatment. I'll research everything I can find about guardianship and child welfare." Harry stared at her in amazement. In the space of half an hour, Hermione had not only promised to be his friend, but had already begun planning ways to improve his entire existence. The methodical thoroughness that sometimes annoyed their classmates felt like a blessing to someone who had never had anyone plan for his well-being before. "You don't have to do all that," he said weakly, still struggling to accept that someone would go to such lengths for his sake. "Yes, I do," Hermione replied firmly. "That's what friends do, Harry. They take care of each other. They fight for each other. They make sure no one has to suffer alone." She stood up and began gathering her transfiguration books, but her movements were different now, purposeful rather than merely studious. When she looked at Harry, her expression held a determination that was almost frightening in its intensity. "Meet me here tomorrow night at 8, she said. "We'll start with a proper study plan and work from there. And Harry, if you ever need to talk, about anything at all, you find me immediately. Day or night, I don't care if I'm in the middle of an exam or asleep or talking to a professor. You are not alone anymore." Harry watched her walk away, her arms full of books and her spine straight with resolve, and felt something he'd never experienced before. Safety. Security. The absolute certainty that someone was on his side, not because they had to be or because they pitied him, but because they chose to be. For the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, Harry Potter smiled without reservation. The future, which had seemed so uncertain and frightening just hours before, now held possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. He had a friend, a real friend who had sworn never to leave his side. He folded Vernon's cruel letter and tucked it away in his robes, but its power to hurt him had been thoroughly diminished. The Dursleys' opinion of his worth no longer mattered. Someone who knew him, who had seen him at his lowest and most vulnerable, had decided he was worth caring about. Harry stood up from the table and made his way back toward Gryffindor Tower, his steps lighter than they'd been in weeks. Tomorrow night he would meet Hermione in the library again. They would study together, plan together, build something that neither of them had ever had before. They would build a family of choice, founded on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than obligation or blood ties. And for the first time in his 11 years of life, Harry Potter was no longer alone. The weeks following their confrontation with Voldemort brought changes to Hogwarts that extended far beyond Harry and Hermione's personal transformation. Word of their partnership, while lacking specific details about the Philosopher's Stone or their enhanced magical connection, had spread throughout the castle with the kind of mythological embellishment that turned ordinary events into legendary tales. By the time they returned to regular classes, their fellow students viewed them with a mixture of awe, curiosity, and carefully concealed envy that made simple interactions considerably more complex than they had been during their first months at school. The casual friendships and dormitory camaraderie that had once felt natural now carried undertones of speculation about their mysterious abilities and the true nature of their partnership. Ron Weasley exemplified the complicated dynamics that had emerged in their social environment. During their first Transfiguration class after returning from the hospital wing, he approached their usual table in the library with obvious hesitation, his expression cycling through uncertainty, hurt feelings, and reluctant admiration. "So," Ron said without preamble, settling into a chair across from them with studied casualness, "I heard you two had quite an adventure while the rest of us were sleeping peacefully in our beds." Harry glanced at Hermione, both of them immediately alert to the undercurrents in Ron's seemingly innocent comment. Their enhanced connection allowed them to share impressions and concerns instantaneously, a capability that had become invaluable for navigating the social complexities of their new status. "We had some unexpected excitement," Hermione replied diplomatically, her tone carefully neutral. "Nothing that concerns anyone else, though. Just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time." Ron's eyebrows rose skeptically at her deflection. "Right," he said with obvious disbelief. "Wrong place, wrong time. That's why half the castle is talking about how you two single-handedly saved the school from some terrible threat that the professors won't discuss publicly." The accuracy of his assessment was uncomfortable, highlighting how difficult it would be to maintain the secrecy Dumbledore had demanded while dealing with the natural curiosity of their peers. Harry felt the Philosopher's Stone's warm presence in his expanded bag, where he'd taken to carrying it after determining that leaving it in the dormitory posed unacceptable security risks. "People like to create stories about things they don't understand," Harry said carefully. "It makes ordinary events seem more interesting than they really were." Ron studied both of them with the kind of penetrating attention that suggested he wasn't buying their casual dismissals. "Look," he said finally, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I know we've had some differences about how much time you spend studying together. But if you're dealing with something dangerous, something that could affect other students, don't you think your friends deserve to know about it?" The question struck at the heart of their current dilemma. They were indeed dealing with something that could affect other students, potentially every person in the wizarding world, but they were also bound by oaths of secrecy that couldn't be violated without severe consequences. "Ron," Hermione said gently, "there are some things that are safer when fewer people know about them. Not because we don't trust you, but because knowledge itself can be dangerous under certain circumstances." Her explanation was both honest and diplomatic, acknowledging his concerns while maintaining the boundaries they needed to preserve. But Harry could see that Ron wasn't entirely satisfied with her response, his expression suggesting that he felt excluded from something significant. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several second-year students who had been observing their interaction with obvious interest. Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil approached their table with the kind of excited energy that suggested they were hoping for dramatic revelations. "Harry," Parvati said breathlessly, "is it true that you and Hermione have some kind of special magical connection now? Seamus said he heard Professor Flitwick talking about unusual magical phenomena in first-year students. Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks at the direct question about their enhanced abilities. The magical bond they shared was indeed detectable by skilled wizards, but discussing it publicly would violate both Dumbledore's instructions and their own need for privacy. "Professor Flitwick discusses lots of magical phenomena," Hermione said smoothly. "It's part of his job as a charms instructor to monitor student magical development." But Lavender wasn't deterred by the deflection. She leaned closer to their table, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Dean Thomas said he saw you two practicing some kind of synchronized magic in the common room last week. Spells that required both of you working together." The observation was accurate, though Harry wished Dean had been less attentive to their collaborative magical practice. They'd been working on integrating their enhanced connection with their regular coursework, learning to coordinate their magical cores for improved spell efficiency and effectiveness. "Lots of students practice magic together," Harry said with forced casualness. "Study groups and collaborative work are pretty common." "Not like what you two do," Ron interjected, his tone carrying a mixture of fascination and resentment. "When you work together, it's like watching one person with two bodies. Your magic synchronizes in ways that don't seem humanly possible." His assessment was both perceptive and troubling, highlighting how visible their enhanced abilities had become despite their efforts at discretion. If their fellow Gryffindors were noticing unusual magical phenomena, it was likely that students from other houses and faculty members were as well. The attention was making Harry increasingly uncomfortable, reminding him of the unwanted fame he'd experienced upon entering the wizarding world. But this was different, more personal and more invasive, focusing on his relationship with Hermione rather than his celebrity status. "I think we need some fresh air," Hermione said suddenly, gathering her books with efficient movements that suggested she shared his desire to escape the scrutiny. "Harry, would you like to take a walk around the grounds?" The suggestion was obviously a tactical retreat, but Harry welcomed the opportunity to discuss their situation away from curious ears and speculative stares. They excused themselves from the library with polite efficiency, leaving their questioners to speculate among themselves about the mysteries they represented. The castle grounds provided a welcome respite from the social pressures of indoor spaces filled with gossiping students. As they walked along the path toward the lake, Harry felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease, replaced by the familiar comfort of Hermione's presence and their shared understanding. "This is going to be a problem," Hermione said without preamble, her analytical mind clearly focused on the implications of their recent interactions. "We can't maintain secrecy about our enhanced abilities when they're becoming visible to casual observation." Harry nodded grimly, recognizing the accuracy of her assessment. The magical bond they shared was growing stronger with use and familiarity, making it increasingly difficult to disguise during their collaborative work. "What do you think we should do?" he asked, trusting her strategic thinking to identify solutions he might miss. Hermione was quiet for several minutes, her expression thoughtful as she considered their options. "We need to develop public techniques that explain our collaborative effectiveness without revealing the true nature of our connection," she said finally. "Ways to demonstrate synchronized magic that could be attributed to exceptional practice and study rather than magical bonding." The idea had merit, providing a plausible explanation for their abilities while maintaining the secrecy Dumbledore had demanded. Harry found himself impressed once again by Hermione's capacity to find practical solutions to complex problems. "Like a performance," he said, understanding her suggestion. "We create a version of our partnership that people can see and understand, while keeping the real depth of our connection private." "Exactly," Hermione agreed with satisfaction. "We let people believe they understand what makes us effective partners while concealing the aspects that would attract dangerous attention or violate our agreements with Professor Dumbledore." They spent the next hour developing what they privately termed their public partnership protocol, a systematic approach to managing their social interactions and magical demonstrations that would satisfy curiosity while protecting their secrets. The work was both strategic and creative, requiring them to think like performers while maintaining their authentic connection. As evening approached and they made their way back toward the castle, Harry found himself reflecting on how much their relationship had evolved since those early days of simple academic collaboration. They were now partners in ways that extended far beyond friendship or romantic attachment, bound together by shared experiences, magical enhancement, and responsibilities that most adults would find overwhelming. The Philosopher's Stone pulsed gently in his bag, a constant reminder of the trust Dumbledore had placed in them and the power they carried. Its presence had become so familiar that he sometimes forgot he was carrying one of the most coveted magical artifacts in existence, but moments like this brought the weight of their responsibility back into sharp focus. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked as they climbed the steps toward the main entrance. "Taking on all this responsibility, becoming guardians of something so dangerous and valuable." Hermione's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Never," she said with fierce conviction. "Harry, what we have now, what we've become together, it's the most meaningful thing in my life. Yes, the responsibility is enormous, but it's also proof that we're capable of handling challenges that would defeat individual wizards far older than us." Her words filled him with the familiar warmth that had nothing to do with magical bonds and everything to do with genuine affection and mutual respect. This was what he'd been missing during his years with the Dursleys, the sense of being valued and trusted by someone who saw his worth clearly. Their return to Gryffindor Tower was marked by the kind of subtle attention that had become typical since their mysterious adventure. Students watched them with curious expressions, conversations paused as they passed, and Harry could feel the weight of speculation following their movements. But instead of the isolation and discomfort he might have felt months earlier, Harry found himself drawing strength from Hermione's steady presence beside him. Whatever challenges their enhanced status brought, they would face them together with the same collaborative approach that had served them so well in academic and magical pursuits. Professor McGonagall intercepted them near the portrait hole, her expression carrying the kind of professional seriousness that suggested this was more than a casual encounter. "Mr. Potter, Miss Granger," she said formally. "Might I have a word with both of you in private?" They followed her to her office, the familiar space now feeling charged with significance as she gestured for them to take seats facing her desk. Harry noticed that she'd added several new books to her collection, titles that seemed focused on advanced magical theory and collaborative spellwork. "I wanted to discuss the changes I've observed in your magical development," McGonagall said without preamble. "Your recent collaborative work has displayed characteristics that suggest significant enhancement of your natural abilities." Harry exchanged a quick glance with Hermione, both of them wondering how much their head of house had deduced about their true situation. McGonagall's observational skills were legendary, and she'd had weeks to analyze their behavior and magical signatures. "Professor," Hermione said carefully, "we've been working very hard to improve our collaborative techniques. Synchronized spell work requires considerable practice and coordination." "Indeed it does," McGonagall agreed, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by Hermione's explanation. "However, the level of synchronization you've achieved typically requires either years of intensive training or magical bonding of a type that's extremely rare among students your age." The direct observation hung in the air between them like a challenge. Harry could feel Hermione's analytical mind working through possible responses, while his own thoughts raced toward potential consequences of discovery. "Professor," Harry said finally, choosing his words with extreme care, "we understand that our partnership is unusual. We've worked very hard to develop our collaborative abilities, and we're committed to using them responsibly." McGonagall studied both students with the kind of penetrating attention that had intimidated generations of Gryffindors. "I'm not questioning your intentions, Mr. Potter," she said finally. "However, I am concerned about the attention your abilities are attracting and the potential implications for your safety and education." She opened a folder on her desk and withdrew several official-looking documents that made Harry's stomach clench with apprehension. I've received inquiries from the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes about unusual magical phenomena detected within the castle," she continued. "Additionally, several parents have written expressing concern about their children's reports of supernatural partnerships among first-year students. The revelation that their activities were attracting official attention was deeply troubling, suggesting that their enhanced abilities were more visible than they'd realized." Harry felt the Philosopher's Stone pulse in his bag, as if responding to his elevated stress levels. "What kind of inquiries?" Hermione asked, her voice steady, despite the concern Harry could sense through their connection. "Questions about the nature and extent of magical bonding among students," McGonagall replied. "Requests for documentation of any unusual incidents or collaborative magical work that exceeds normal student capabilities." She set the documents aside and leaned back in her chair, her expression growing more personal and less officially stern. "I want you both to understand that I have no intention of compromising your privacy or reporting details of your partnership to external authorities," she said. "However, I also need to ensure that you're not putting yourselves or other students at risk through magical experimentation beyond your current understanding." The offer of protection and discretion was both welcome and complicated, suggesting that McGonagall suspected more about their situation than she was stating directly. Harry appreciated her loyalty to her students, but he also recognized the difficult position she was in as both their protector and a faculty member with institutional responsibilities. "Professor," Hermione said thoughtfully, "what would you need from us to satisfy external inquiries while protecting our privacy?" McGonagall's expression grew approving at the diplomatic approach to problem-solving. "Documentation of your collaborative techniques and their applications," she replied. "Evidence that your partnership represents advanced but conventional magical development rather than phenomena requiring official investigation." The solution she was proposing aligned well with their own public partnership protocol, providing official validation for their cover story while maintaining the secrecy their situation required. Harry found himself grateful once again for the adults in his life who chose to protect rather than exploit his unusual circumstances. "We can provide that documentation," Harry said with confidence. "Our techniques are advanced, but they're based on established magical theory and extensive practice." "Excellent," McGonagall said with satisfaction. "I'll expect your report within a week, and I'll use it to respond to external inquiries in ways that protect your privacy while demonstrating appropriate oversight of student magical development." As they left McGonagall's office and made their way back toward Gryffindor Tower, Harry felt a mixture of relief and renewed determination. The challenges facing them were growing more complex, but they were also discovering unexpected sources of support from adults who recognized their worth and chose to protect rather than control their development. The partnership that had begun with tears and promises in a corner of the library had evolved into something that was reshaping their entire social environment. They were no longer just exceptional students. They were young wizards whose collaborative abilities were attracting attention from the highest levels of magical society. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they continued integrating their enhanced abilities with their educational goals while maintaining the secrecy that protected both themselves and others. But tonight, they would rest in the knowledge that they had each other and the support of people who believed in their potential to handle responsibilities far beyond their years. Harry Potter was learning what it meant to be part of something larger than individual magic, a partnership that commanded respect and offered protection in equal measure. The letter from Hermione's parents arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, delivered by a barn owl that looked distinctly uncomfortable with the formality of Hogwarts's Great Hall. Harry watched as Hermione broke the wax seal with careful fingers, her expression growing brighter with each line she read. When she finished, she looked up at him, with eyes that sparkled with excitement, and something that looked suspiciously like tears of joy. "They want to meet you," she said quietly, leaning close enough that her words wouldn't carry to nearby students. "My parents. They've invited you to spend part of the summer with us. and they want to know if there's anything they can do to help with your situation regarding your relatives." Harry felt his chest tighten with a mixture of hope and anxiety that made it difficult to breathe properly. The idea of spending time in a home where he was actually wanted, where adults cared about his well-being and happiness, seemed almost too good to be true. But it was the second part of Hermione's message that really caught his attention. "What did you tell them?" he asked carefully. "About the Dursleys, I mean." Hermione's expression grew serious as she folded the letter and tucked it safely into her robes. "I told them the truth, Harry. Not everything, because some things need to stay private, but enough that they understand you've been living with people who don't appreciate or care for you properly. The concept of adults who would be concerned about his welfare simply because it was the right thing to do, not because of fame or obligation, was still foreign enough to make Harry feel slightly dizzy. Throughout his life, adult attention had meant criticism, punishment, or exploitation. The possibility that Hermione's parents might genuinely care about his happiness felt revolutionary. "What kind of help are they talking about?" he asked, though part of him was afraid to hope for too much. "Legal help," Hermione replied with the kind of quiet determination that meant she'd been researching extensively. "My father has connections with solicitors who specialize in child welfare cases. They think there might be ways to challenge the Dursleys' guardianship, especially given the documented history of emotional abuse and educational neglect." The words hit Harry like a physical blow, not because they were painful, but because they offered something he'd never dared to imagine: freedom, the possibility of a life where he wasn't constantly walking on eggshells, where he didn't have to hide his magical abilities or pretend to be grateful for basic necessities that should have been freely given. "But Harry," she continued, her voice taking on the careful tone she used when discussing particularly sensitive topics, "any legal action would require documentation of the abuse you've experienced. Detailed records, witness statements, evidence that would hold up in court proceedings." Harry's initial excitement dimmed as he considered the implications of what she was describing. Exposing his childhood to legal scrutiny would mean reliving every humiliation, every casual cruelty, every moment when the Dursleys had made clear that he was unwanted and unwelcome in their home. "I don't know if I can do that," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of breakfast conversations. "Talking about it with you is one thing, but having to prove it to strangers, having to convince people that it really was as bad as I remember." Hermione reached across the table to squeeze his hand, her touch warm and reassuring through their enhanced magical connection. "You wouldn't have to do it alone," she said firmly. "I'd be there with you every step of the way, and so would my parents. We'd make sure you had support and advocacy throughout the entire process." The offer was overwhelming in its generosity, but it also raised questions about what accepting such help would mean for their relationship and his independence. Harry had spent his entire life learning to rely only on himself, and the idea of accepting assistance from adults who weren't obligated to provide, it felt both wonderful and terrifying. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would your parents care enough to get involved in something this complicated and potentially difficult?" Hermione's smile in response was radiant, transforming her entire face with warmth and affection. "Because you're important to me, Harry," she said simply. "Because they can see how much our friendship means to both of us, and they want to make sure nothing threatens that. And because they're the kind of people who believe that all children deserve to be safe and loved." The explanation struck Harry as almost impossibly noble, so different from his experience with adult motivations that it took several moments for him to fully process what she was telling him. Hermione's parents were willing to invest time, money, and energy in his welfare, simply because he mattered to their daughter. "I'd like to meet them," Harry said finally, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. "And I'd like to learn about what options might be available. Even if I'm not ready to take legal action right now, having information would be valuable." Hermione's expression grew bright with satisfaction and relief. "They'll be so pleased," she said, with obvious happiness. "My mother has already started researching magical guardianship laws, and my father has been consulting with colleagues about the intersection between Muggle and Wizarding legal systems." The revelation that her parents had already begun working on his behalf before even receiving confirmation that he was interested in their help filled Harry with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Gratitude seemed inadequate for the scope of what they were offering, while hope felt too fragile for something this significant. Over the following weeks, their correspondence with the Grangers evolved into something resembling legal preparation mixed with family planning. Hermione's parents sent detailed questionnaires about Harry's experiences with the Dursleys, requests for documentation of his magical education and living situation, and increasingly warm personal messages that made clear their genuine concern for his well-being. Harry found himself spending hours crafting responses to their questions, working with Hermione to ensure that his answers were both honest and appropriately detailed. The process was emotionally exhausting but also deeply therapeutic, forcing him to articulate experiences he'd never been able to discuss openly, and to recognize patterns of abuse he'd previously minimized or dismissed. The most significant breakthrough came when Hermione suggested they document not just the abuse he'd suffered, but also the educational and developmental opportunities he'd been denied. The Dursleys hadn't simply mistreated him, they'd actively prevented him from reaching his potential in ways that had lasting consequences for his academic and social development. "Look at this," Hermione said one evening as they worked through another questionnaire in their usual library corner. Question 15 asks about educational support and enrichment opportunities. "Harry, you've told me that the Dursleys never helped you with homework, never encouraged reading, never provided educational materials beyond what was absolutely required by law." Harry nodded grimly, remembering countless evenings when he'd struggled with assignments while Dudley received tutoring and educational support that had been systematically denied to him. The contrast had been so consistent that he'd assumed it was normal until experiencing Hermione's descriptions of her own childhood. "They also asks about emotional support and positive reinforcement," she continued, her voice growing angry as she read through the questions. "When did the Dursleys last praise your achievements, encourage your interests, or express pride in your accomplishments?" The question hung in the air between them, because they both knew the answer was never. The Dursleys had never celebrated his successes or offered encouragement for his efforts, viewing any achievement on his part as either insignificant or somehow threatening to their own family dynamic. "This isn't just about physical abuse or neglect," Hermione said with growing understanding. "This is about systematic psychological damage designed to keep you from developing confidence or independence. They wanted you to believe you were worthless, so you wouldn't challenge their authority or expect better treatment." Her analysis was both painful and liberating, providing a framework for understanding his childhood that didn't require him to blame himself for the Dursleys' cruelty. They hadn't mistreated him because he was inherently flawed. They'd mistreated him because they were inadequate guardians who had chosen to prioritize their own convenience over his well-being. The legal research they conducted together revealed a complex intersection of Muggle and magical authority that made Harry's situation more complicated than simple child welfare cases. As the boy who lived, he occupied a unique position in Wizarding society that created additional considerations about his placement and guardianship. But it also revealed protections and resources that might be available to him, legal precedents that could support his case for emancipation or alternative guardianship arrangements. The more they learned, the more convinced Harry became that pursuing legal action might not only be possible but advisable for his long-term well-being. The emotional support he received from Hermione throughout this process was invaluable, but it was the steady encouragement from her parents that really began to change his perspective about what kind of future might be possible. Their letters weren't just formal legal correspondence, they were warm, personal communications that treated him like a valued family member rather than a case study. "Dear Harry," one particularly meaningful letter began, We want you to know that regardless of what legal options prove viable, you will always have a home with us during school holidays and summer breaks. Hermione has told us so much about your friendship and academic partnership, and we're excited to meet the young man who has brought such joy and intellectual stimulation to our daughter's life. The casual assumption that he would be welcome in their home, that his presence would be a source of happiness rather than burden, was so different from his experience with the Dursleys that Harry had to read the passage several times before he could fully accept what they were offering. But it was the final paragraph of that letter that really captured his attention and filled him with hope for the future. We've been researching magical guardianship options, and we believe there may be ways to establish formal protection for your welfare that wouldn't require severing all connections to your magical relatives. The goal isn't necessarily to punish the Dursleys, but to ensure that you have adults in your life who are committed to supporting your happiness and development. The approach they were suggesting felt both practical and compassionate, focusing on his future well-being rather than retribution for past mistreatment. It offered the possibility of freedom without requiring him to engage in a prolonged legal battle that might be more traumatic than therapeutic. As the school year drew toward its close and final examinations approached, Harry found himself looking forward to the summer with excitement rather than dread for the first time in his memory. The prospect of spending time with people who actually wanted his company, who were interested in his thoughts and experiences, who would celebrate his achievements rather than viewing them as threats, felt like stepping into an entirely different world. The night before their last exam, as they sat in their familiar corner of the library, surrounded by the organized chaos of revision materials and research notes, Hermione broached the subject that had been underlying all their summer planning. "Harry," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something important about our enhanced connection and the Philosopher's Stone. My parents don't know about either of those things, and we need to decide how we're going to handle that during the summer." Harry had been dreading this conversation, even as he'd known it was inevitable. The magical bond they shared, and their guardianship of one of the most powerful artifacts in existence, were secrets that couldn't be casually mentioned during family dinners, but they were also integral parts of who they'd become together. "What do you think we should do?" he asked, trusting her strategic thinking to identify approaches he might miss. Hermione was quiet for a moment, clearly working through the complexities and potential complications of their situation. "I think," she said finally, "that we tell them about our enhanced magical connection, but not about the stone. The bond is something they should know about, because it affects our well-being and our relationship. But the stone is a security issue that's safer when fewer people know about it." Her reasoning made sense, providing a way to be honest about the most important aspects of their situation while maintaining the secrecy that protected both themselves and others. Harry appreciated her ability to find practical solutions to seemingly impossible problems. "How do we explain the connection?" he asked. "I mean, magical bonding isn't exactly common knowledge in the Muggle world." "We tell them the truth," Hermione replied with characteristic directness, "that we've developed an unusually close friendship that has magical components, and that this connection helps us support each other emotionally and academically. They don't need to understand all the technical details to accept that it's important to our well-being." The approach felt both honest and manageable, allowing them to share the most significant aspects of their development while maintaining appropriate boundaries about information that required more discretion. As they packed up their materials and prepared to return to Gryffindor Tower for their final night as first-year students, Harry reflected on how dramatically his life had changed over the past months. The frightened, lonely boy who had cried in this same corner of the library had been replaced by someone with genuine friendships, academic achievements, magical capabilities, and now the prospect of a loving family environment. Tomorrow they would board the Hogwarts Express and return to the outside world, but this time Harry would be traveling toward people who wanted him rather than away from those who did. The summer would bring new challenges, as they integrated their enhanced partnership with family relationships and legal proceedings. But it would also bring opportunities for growth and healing that he'd never imagined possible. The Philosopher's Stone pulsed gently in his bag, a reminder of the responsibilities they carried and the power they'd proven capable of wielding wisely. Their guardianship of the ancient artifact was a secret they would maintain, but their partnership itself was something they could celebrate and share with people who had earned their trust. Harry Potter was no longer just surviving his circumstances. He was actively shaping a future filled with people who valued his happiness and supported his development. The partnership that had begun with tears and promises was about to expand into a chosen family that would provide the foundation for whatever challenges lay ahead. The final examinations at Hogwarts had always been approached by students with varying degrees of anxiety and preparation, but for Harry and Hermione, the tests represented something far more significant than simple academic assessment. They were a demonstration of everything they'd accomplished together over their first year, a showcase of the collaborative excellence and mutual support that had transformed them both from isolated individuals into an unstoppable intellectual partnership. As they sat in the Great Hall on the morning of their first examination, Transfiguration Theory with Professor McGonagall supervising, Harry felt a calm confidence that would have been impossible just months earlier. The nervous energy that typically surrounded major tests was muted by his absolute certainty that he and Hermione had prepared as thoroughly as humanly possible, their combined knowledge and complementary perspectives creating a comprehensive understanding of every subject they would face. The written portion of Transfiguration began with fundamental principles, questions about magical theory and mathematical relationships that Harry found himself answering with the kind of detailed precision that Hermione's tutoring had made second nature. Where once he might have struggled with complex formulas or theoretical applications, he now approached each problem with systematic analysis that drew on months of collaborative study sessions. But it was during the practical examination that their true achievements became evident. When Professor McGonagall called them forward to demonstrate advanced transformation techniques, Harry and Hermione moved with the seamless coordination that had become their signature, their magical cores synchronizing in ways that enhanced both their individual abilities and their collaborative effectiveness. The spell they performed together, a complex series of transformations that turned a simple wooden block into an intricate mechanical timepiece, complete with moving gears and precise timekeeping capabilities, drew audible gasps from their classmates and an expression of frank amazement from McGonagall herself. "Extraordinary," the professor murmured, examining their creation with professional appreciation. The level of precision required for this transformation typically exceeds first-year capabilities by several academic years. Your collaborative technique has achieved results that individual wizards would find extremely challenging. Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks at the praise, but it was tempered by genuine confidence in their abilities and pride in what they'd accomplished together. The frightened boy who had once assumed he was too stupid for academic success had been replaced by someone capable of magical feats that impressed even his most demanding professors. Their success in Transfiguration set the tone for the remaining examinations. Charms with Professor Flitwick became an opportunity to demonstrate their enhanced spellwork and theoretical understanding, with both students achieving marks that placed them among the highest scorers in their year. Defense Against the Dark Arts, despite the absence of Professor Quirrell, allowed them to display practical magical skills that drew on their recent real-world experience with dark magic. But it was their potions examination with Professor Snape that truly showcased how much their partnership had evolved their individual capabilities. The notoriously difficult professor had designed a practical test that required not only precise ingredient preparation and brewing technique, but also theoretical analysis of complex magical interactions. Harry approached his assigned potion, a complicated healing draft that required exact timing and temperature control, with the kind of methodical confidence that Hermione's influence had instilled in him. Rather than rushing through the steps or second-guessing his instincts, he applied the systematic approach they'd developed together, checking each measurement and monitoring each reaction with scientific precision. When Snape examined his finished product, the professor's expression cycled through surprise, suspicion, and grudging acknowledgement. "Potter," he said with obvious reluctance, "this potion demonstrates competence that exceeds my expectations for your abilities. The theoretical analysis you've included shows understanding of advanced magical principles." The backhanded compliment was probably the closest thing to praise Harry would ever receive from Snape, but it filled him with satisfaction nonetheless. He'd proven to himself and to his most critical professor that he was capable of excellence when given proper support and encouragement. Hermione's performance across all examinations was, predictably, outstanding in every respect. But what struck Harry most profoundly was how their partnership had elevated not just his own achievements, but hers as well. Her practical magic had become more intuitive and flexible, while her theoretical knowledge had gained the kind of real-world application that transformed academic understanding into genuine expertise. As they completed their final examination and left the testing chamber together, Harry felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with finishing their first-year coursework. They had proven to themselves and to their professors that their collaborative approach to learning was not just effective, but transformative, creating capabilities that neither could have achieved independently. The results, when they were posted several days later, exceeded even their ambitious expectations. Both students had achieved the highest marks in their year across every subject, with several professors adding personal notes of commendation for exceptional achievement and innovative approaches to complex problems. Outstanding performance in collaborative magical work, Professor McGonagall's note read, "Demonstrates advanced theoretical understanding combined with exceptional practical application. Recommended for accelerated study opportunities in second year." Harry stared at the assessment in disbelief, reading it several times to ensure he wasn't misunderstanding the words. Outstanding. Exceptional. Recommended for advancement. These were evaluations that would have been impossible for the frightened, isolated boy who had entered Hogwarts just months earlier. "We did it," Hermione said quietly beside him, her voice thick with emotion as she read her own equally impressive results. "Harry, we really did it. We proved that working together makes us both better than we could be alone." Her words captured something essential about their achievement that went beyond simple academic success. They had created a partnership that transformed individual limitations into collective strengths, loneliness into mutual support, and academic struggle into collaborative excellence. The celebration in Gryffindor Tower that evening was unlike anything Harry had ever experienced. His housemates, who had watched their partnership develop over the course of the year, now surrounded them with genuine admiration and warmth that felt completely different from the uncomfortable attention he'd received because of his fame. "Brilliant work, mate," Ron said, with obvious sincerity, clapping Harry on the shoulder with enthusiasm that seemed to carry no trace of his earlier resentment about their intensive study schedule. "You and Hermione have set a standard that the rest of us will be trying to match for years." The acceptance and celebration from their peers felt like a validation of everything they'd built together, confirmation that their partnership was viewed as something inspiring rather than threatening by the people whose opinions mattered most. But it was Professor Dumbledore's appearance in the common room later that evening that provided the most significant recognition of their achievements. The headmaster's presence immediately quieted the celebration, students gathering around with respectful attention as he approached Harry and Hermione directly. "Mr. Potter, Miss Granger," Dumbledore said, with formal courtesy that carried undertones of genuine warmth, "I wanted to personally congratulate you on your exceptional examination results and to discuss some opportunities that have become available as a result of your outstanding academic performance." Harry felt his pulse quicken at the headmaster's words, wondering what kinds of opportunities might be offered to first-year students who had demonstrated capabilities far beyond their age level. "Your collaborative approach to magical learning has attracted considerable attention from various academic institutions and research organizations, Dumbledore continued. Several have expressed interest in providing advanced study opportunities or specialized instruction that would allow you to continue developing your remarkable partnership. The possibility of expanded educational opportunities felt both exciting and overwhelming, representing recognition of their abilities from the highest levels of magical academia. Harry glanced at Hermione, noting the excitement and analytical consideration flickering across her features as she processed the implications. "What kind of opportunities, Professor?" Hermione asked with diplomatic curiosity. Dumbledore's eyes began to twinkle with the warmth that had become familiar over their months at Hogwarts. Summer intensive programs, advanced theoretical courses, research assistantships with established magical scholars, he replied. Organizations that specialize in collaborative magical development have expressed particular interest in studying and supporting your partnership. The offer was remarkable, but Harry found himself thinking immediately about the summer plans they'd already made with Hermione's parents, and the legal proceedings that might free him from the Dursleys permanently. "Professor," Harry said carefully, "we've already made commitments for this summer that are very important to our personal development. Would it be possible to pursue these academic opportunities while also honoring our existing obligations?" Dumbledore's expression grew thoughtful as he considered Harry's response. "Indeed," he said approvingly, "honoring one's commitments is a mark of character that serves as an excellent foundation for advanced academic work. I believe arrangements could be made that would accommodate both your personal obligations and these educational opportunities." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Dumbledore outlining various possibilities for advanced study that could be integrated with their summer plans and ongoing responsibilities. By the time he departed, Harry and Hermione had been presented with options that would have seemed impossibly ambitious just months earlier. As the common room gradually emptied and they found themselves alone near the dying fire, Harry reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred since that first night when Hermione had found him crying in the library. The frightened, lonely boy who had believed he was worthless and unwanted had become someone whose academic achievements commanded respect from the most accomplished wizards in Britain. "Do you believe it?" he asked Hermione quietly, gesturing toward the examination results that still seemed too good to be true. "That we actually accomplished all this in just 1 year?" Hermione's smile in response was radiant, filled with pride and affection and absolute confidence in their shared achievements. "I believe it because I lived it, Harry," she replied. "Every late-night study session, every collaborative project, every moment when we supported each other through difficulties or celebrated successes together. We didn't just achieve academic excellence, we built something that will last for the rest of our lives." Her words captured the profound truth about what they'd created together, a partnership that extended far beyond academic collaboration into the realm of genuine family bonds and mutual commitment. The enhanced magical connection they shared was simply one manifestation of a deeper unity that had transformed both their lives. As they prepared to board the Hogwarts Express the following morning, Harry felt none of the dread and anxiety that had characterized previous returns to the outside world. Instead, he experienced eager anticipation for a summer that would bring new challenges and opportunities, time with people who valued his happiness, and continued growth in his partnership with the most important person in his life. The train journey back to London was filled with animated conversations about their plans for continued study, discussions about the legal proceedings that might secure Harry's freedom, and speculation about what their second year at Hogwarts might bring. Other students stopped by their compartment throughout the journey, offering congratulations on their examination results and expressing admiration for their collaborative achievements. But it was during the quiet moments, when they sat together watching the Scottish countryside roll past their window, that Harry felt most profoundly grateful for everything that had changed. The Philosopher's Stone pulsed gently in his bag, a reminder of the extraordinary responsibilities they had accepted and proven capable of handling with wisdom beyond their years. As the train pulled into King's Cross Station, and they prepared to part ways temporarily for the first time since forming their partnership, Harry felt a flutter of anxiety about maintaining their connection across the physical distance. But when Hermione took his hand, their enhanced magical bond flared with warmth and reassurance that transcended any concerns about separation. "This isn't goodbye," she said, with absolute certainty. "This is just the beginning of the next phase of everything we're building together. In 2 weeks, you'll be with my family, and we'll continue growing and learning and supporting each other just like we always have." Harry nodded, feeling the truth of her words resonate through their shared connection. The partnership that had begun with tears and promises had evolved into something powerful enough to reshape their entire world. Whatever challenges the future brought, they would face them together, with the same collaborative excellence and mutual devotion that had made their first year at Hogwarts a triumph beyond anything either had dared to imagine. As he walked through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, Harry Potter was no longer the unwanted boy returning reluctantly to people who viewed him as a burden. He was a young wizard with proven abilities, genuine achievements, caring family relationships, and most importantly, an unbreakable bond with someone who had chosen to stand beside him through every challenge and celebration. The future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibilities they were only beginning to explore. The next evening arrived with the kind of crisp October air that made the castle's ancient stones seem to exhale centuries of accumulated warmth. Harry found himself checking his watch repeatedly during dinner, his appetite diminished by a mixture of anticipation and lingering disbelief that someone actually wanted to spend time with him. The great hall buzzed with its usual evening energy, students comparing notes about the day's lessons and making plans for the weekend, but Harry felt oddly detached from it all, as if he were watching the scene through glass. Hermione sat several seats down at the Gryffindor table, methodically working her way through her meal while simultaneously reviewing notes from ancient runes. Even from a distance, Harry could see the careful precision with which she approached everything, from the neat arrangement of her textbooks to the measured way she consumed her food. It was the behavior of someone who had learned early that excellence required constant vigilance, that there was no room for carelessness when you were already fighting an uphill battle for acceptance. When she glanced up and caught his eye, offering a small smile that was both reassuring and conspiratorial, Harry felt that same flutter of hope he'd experienced the night before. Someone was looking out for him. Someone had made promises and intended to keep them. The novelty of it still felt too good to be true, but the steady warmth in Hermione's expression suggested it was real. 8 o'clock found Harry making his way through the corridors toward the library, his bag packed with every textbook he owned, and a growing sense of nervous excitement. The evening crowd had thinned considerably, most students having retreated to their common rooms for relaxation or early bedtime routines. The few he encountered in the hallways barely glanced in his direction, too preoccupied with their own concerns to notice one small first year heading toward an evening study session. Hermione was already waiting when he arrived, having claimed the same secluded corner table where she'd found him the night before. The choice felt deliberate, as if she wanted to reclaim the space where his breakdown had occurred and transform it into something positive. She had spread her materials across the surface with characteristic organization, different subjects arranged in neat stacks, according to some system that probably made perfect sense to her methodical mind. "Right on time," she said approvingly, as Harry approached, her voice pitched low to avoid disturbing the few other students scattered throughout the library. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night, and I have several ideas about how we can structure our study partnership to benefit both of us." Harry settled into the chair beside her, the same position she'd chosen the evening before when offering comfort and companionship. The symbolism wasn't lost on him, the way she consistently chose to sit with him rather than across from him, presenting a united front against whatever challenges they might face. "Before we get to academics, though," Hermione continued, reaching into her bag and producing a thick manila folder that looked suspiciously official. I want to show you something. I spent most of today in the library researching child welfare laws, both magical and muggle. What your relatives did to you, Harry, it has names, legal names. And there are consequences for people who treat children the way they treated you. Harry's stomach clenched as she opened the folder, revealing pages of carefully handwritten notes interspersed with what appeared to be copied passages from legal texts. The thoroughness of her research was both impressive and overwhelming, evidence of the serious commitment she'd made to his well-being. I found references to something called educational neglect, she said, pointing to a particular section of notes. Deliberately preventing a child from attending appropriate schooling or receiving necessary educational support. The Dursleys kept you ignorant of your magical heritage and tried to prevent you from attending Hogwarts. That's a crime, Harry, both in the Muggle and Wizarding worlds. Her finger moved to another section, and Harry could see the controlled anger in the precise way she'd underlined certain phrases. Then there's emotional abuse and psychological maltreatment, she continued. Consistent pattern of behavior that damages a child's emotional development and sense of self-worth. Calling you names, telling you you're worthless, making you live in a cupboard, those aren't just mean things they did. They're documented forms of child abuse that have lasting psychological effects. Harry stared at the pages spread before him, feeling a strange mixture of validation and vertigo. For so many years, he'd accepted the Dursleys' treatment as normal, as something he deserved because of his freakish nature. Having someone catalogue their behavior in clinical legal terms was deeply unsettling, but also oddly liberating. You really think what they did was that bad? He asked quietly, still struggling against years of conditioning that insisted his suffering was his own fault. Hermione looked up from her notes, her brown eyes blazing with the same fierce protectiveness he'd seen the night before. Harry, she said firmly, what they did was criminal. Not morally questionable, not merely unkind, but actually illegal according to multiple legal systems. You were systematically abused by people who were supposed to care for you, and the fact that you survived it with your capacity for kindness intact is frankly miraculous. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, the gesture both comforting and grounding. I've also been researching magical guardianship laws, she continued. There are provisions for removing children from unsuitable homes, especially in cases where Muggle relatives are actively hostile to magical development. Professor McGonagall would be required to investigate if a formal complaint were filed. The idea of involving a professor, of making his private shame public knowledge, made Harry's chest tighten with anxiety. But before he could voice his concerns, Hermione seemed to anticipate his thoughts. We don't have to do anything right now, she said gently. I'm just gathering information so we know what our options are. Knowledge is power, Harry. The more we understand about your legal rights and protections, the better equipped we'll be to make decisions about your future. Harry nodded slowly, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what she'd accomplished in a single day. The idea that someone cared enough to spend hours researching ways to help him still felt surreal, but the evidence was spread across the table in her neat handwriting. Thank you, he said finally, the words feeling inadequate but heartfelt. Nobody has ever bothered to find out if what they did was wrong. You spent your whole day on this? Not my whole day, Hermione replied with a small smile. I also worked out a study schedule for us, and started reading ahead in potions so I can help you navigate Snape's more unreasonable demands. She pulled out another folder, this one containing what appeared to be a meticulously planned academic calendar. Color-coded charts showed their class schedules, homework due dates, and blocked out time periods for collaborative study sessions. It was the kind of organizational masterpiece that would have taken Harry hours to create, assuming he even knew where to begin. I've noticed that you have excellent intuitive understanding of practical magic, she said, pointing to various sections of the schedule. Your wand work in charms is particularly strong, and you seem to grasp the underlying principles even when you can't articulate why something works. I think you'd benefit from more theoretical foundation to support those instincts. Meanwhile, she continued, flipping to another section, I tend to get so caught up in the theory that I sometimes struggle with practical application. Your natural magical instincts could help me understand how to translate knowledge into effective spell work. Harry studied the schedule, marveling at the way she'd identified specific areas where they could complement each other's strengths. It was the kind of strategic thinking he'd never applied to his own education, partly because he'd never had anyone to collaborate with, and partly because the Dursleys had trained him to expect failure rather than success. "This is incredible," he said, tracing one of the color-coded sections with his finger. "But are you sure you want to spend this much time studying with me? I mean, you're obviously brilliant. You could probably tutor half-hour a year if you wanted to." Hermione's expression grew thoughtful, and she was quiet for a moment before responding. "I've been thinking about that, actually," she said, finally. "About why I want to do this, I mean. I could study with other people, technically speaking. But most of our classmates don't actually want to learn, Harry. They want to get by with minimum effort and maximum social advantage." She gestured toward the main area of the library, where they could hear the occasional whispered conversation between students more focused on gossip than academics. "You're different," she continued. "When you ask questions, it's because you genuinely want to understand something, not because you're trying to impress anyone or show off how clever you are. When I explain a concept, you listen completely, really think about what I'm saying, and then ask follow-up questions that show you're engaging with the material on a deeper level." Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks at the praise, unused to having his intellectual capabilities acknowledged in any positive way. "Plus," Hermione added with a grin that was both mischievous and fond, "you're the only person in our year who doesn't seem to find my enthusiasm for learning annoying. Do you know how refreshing it is to have someone actually want to discuss the theoretical implications of transfiguration theory instead of just memorizing the minimum required for exams?" They spent the next 2 hours working through their transfiguration homework together, and Harry quickly discovered that Hermione's teaching style was both patient and demanding. She never made him feel stupid for not understanding something immediately, but she also refused to accept superficial comprehension when deeper understanding was possible. When he struggled with the mathematical calculations required for size alteration spells, she didn't simply provide the answers. Instead, she worked through several examples with him, helping him identify the underlying patterns and develop strategies for approaching similar problems independently. "You're getting it," she said, encouragingly, when he successfully calculated the proportional changes needed for their next assignment. "I can see the exact moment when the concept clicks into place. Your face lights up like someone just revealed a fascinating secret." Harry ducked his head, still uncomfortable with praise, but unable to suppress a pleased smile. Working with Hermione felt like discovering a part of himself he'd never known existed. The boy who had been told he was stupid and worthless for 11 years was apparently capable of complex magical theory when given proper support and encouragement. As the evening wore on and the library grew progressively quieter, their conversation naturally drifted from academics to more personal topics. Hermione shared stories about her parents, both dentists who had been initially bewildered by their daughter's magical abilities, but had quickly rallied to support her in every way possible. "They were terrified when my Hogwarts letter arrived," she admitted, carefully organizing her notes as she spoke. "Not because they were opposed to magic, but because they realized I was entering a world where they couldn't guide or protect me the way they had when I was younger." She paused, seeming to consider her next words carefully. "They spent the entire summer before I started here, reading every book about wizarding culture they could find, trying to understand what I might face as a Muggle-born witch. They wanted to make sure I was prepared for potential prejudice or discrimination." Harry listened with a mixture of fascination and envy, trying to imagine what it would feel like to have parents who worried about your well-being and actively worked to prepare you for challenges you might encounter. "They sound wonderful," he said sincerely, and Hermione's face brightened with obvious affection for her family. "They are," she replied simply, "which is why what your relatives did to you makes me so angry, Harry. Every child deserves parents who want them to succeed, who celebrate their achievements and help them work through their struggles. The fact that you never had that you were actively undermined and sabotaged by the very people who should have protected you, it's not just sad. It's infuriating." Her hands had clenched into fists on the table, and Harry found himself oddly moved by the intensity of her anger on his behalf. No one had ever been indignant about his treatment before. The few teachers who had noticed his situation at primary school had offered vague sympathy, but no concrete assistance. Hermione's rage felt like a validation he hadn't known he needed. "I used to think maybe I deserved it," he said, quietly, voicing a fear he'd carried for years. "Maybe I really was as worthless and freakish as they said, and they were just responding to something fundamentally wrong with me." Hermione's response was swift and uncompromising. "That's exactly what abusers want their victims to believe, Harry. They convince you that their cruelty is your fault, that you somehow earned or deserved their treatment. It's a deliberate strategy to maintain control and prevent you from seeking help." She pulled out one of her research folders and flipped to a section marked with angry red ink. "I found extensive documentation about the psychological effects of emotional abuse on children," she said. "Victims frequently internalize their abuser's messages about their worth and capabilities. It's called learned helplessness, and it's a recognized response to prolonged trauma." Harry stared at the clinical descriptions of behaviors and thought patterns that felt uncomfortably familiar. The tendency to assume blame for others' reactions, the expectation of rejection or abandonment, the difficulty accepting genuine praise or affection, all of it mapped onto his own experience with disturbing accuracy. "The good news," Hermione continued, her voice growing warmer and more encouraging, "is that these effects aren't permanent. With proper support and positive relationships, people can learn to recognize their actual worth and develop healthier ways of thinking about themselves and others." She reached across the table and took his hand again, the gesture becoming a familiar source of comfort and connection. "That's part of what I want to help you with, Harry. Not just the academic work, though that's important too. I want to help you see yourself the way other people see you, the way you actually are, rather than the way they taught you to think about yourself." Harry squeezed her hand, feeling that same flutter of hope and disbelief that had been his constant companion since their friendship began. The idea that he might be capable of change, that the Dursleys' assessment of his character wasn't final or immutable, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. "What if I can't?" he asked, voicing his deepest fear. "What if I'm too damaged or too used to being alone? What if I disappoint you or mess this up somehow?" Hermione was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering her response carefully. When she spoke, her voice carried absolute conviction. "Harry," she said finally, "friendship isn't a performance where one mistake means failure. It's a choice that two people make repeatedly, every day, to care about each other and show up for each other, regardless of circumstances." She gestured to the folders spread across their table, to the hours they'd spent working together, to the careful attention she'd paid to understanding both his academic needs and emotional history. "I didn't do all this research and planning because I expect you to be perfect," she continued. "I did it because I believe you're worth the effort, worth the time and energy it takes to build something meaningful together. You don't have to earn my friendship, Harry. You already have it." By the time they packed up their materials and prepared to return to Gryffindor Tower, Harry felt as though something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. The boy who had entered the library, expecting to struggle through homework alone, was leaving with not just academic support, but a comprehensive plan for addressing years of accumulated trauma and neglect. As they walked through the corridors together, their footsteps echoing softly in the late evening quiet, Hermione outlined their schedule for the coming week: daily study sessions, collaborative work on major assignments, and regular check-ins about how he was processing everything they'd discussed. "Remember," she said, as they reached the portrait of the fat lady, "you're not alone anymore. Whatever happens, whatever you need, you find me immediately. I meant what I said last night about day or night, exams or sleep. Your well-being matters more than any of that." Harry nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by the scope of support she was offering, but no longer doubting its sincerity. As they climbed through the portrait hole and into the warm bustle of the Gryffindor common room, he caught sight of Ron and Seamus bent over a game of wizard's chess near the fire. For the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, Harry felt no envy watching their easy camaraderie. He had something different now, something deeper and more intentional than casual friendship. He had someone who saw his struggles and chose to help rather than turning away. Someone who believed he was capable of growth and healing and deserving of genuine care. The future, which had seemed so uncertain and frightening just 24 hours earlier, now held possibilities he was only beginning to imagine. Tomorrow they would meet again in the library. They would continue building the foundation of trust and mutual support that would carry them both through whatever challenges lay ahead. Harry Potter climbed the stairs to his dormitory with lighter steps than he'd had in years, Hermione's promise echoing in his mind like a protective charm. He was no longer facing the world alone. 3 weeks into their partnership, the library corner that had once witnessed Harry's breakdown had been transformed into something resembling a command center. Hermione had somehow convinced Madame Pince to let them claim the secluded table on a semi-permanent basis, and the librarian now nodded approvingly whenever she saw them settling in for another evening of intensive study. Their materials had expanded beyond simple homework assignments, to include advanced texts, borrowed from the upper year sections, research notes on magical theory that went far beyond first-year curriculum, and carefully organized folders tracking their progress across multiple subjects. Harry arrived early that particular evening, his arms loaded with books and a growing sense of anticipation that had become his constant companion whenever their study sessions approached. The transformation in his academic performance over the past month had been nothing short of remarkable. But more importantly, the transformation in his sense of self-worth had been revolutionary. For the first time in his life, he was not merely surviving his education, but actively excelling at it. Hermione was already there when he rounded the corner into their section, but she wasn't alone. Professor McGonagall stood beside their table, examining the spread of advanced texts and research materials with an expression that seemed to shift between impressed and concerned. Harry's stomach clenched with anxiety as he approached, wondering if they were in trouble for something, if their intensive study schedule had somehow violated school rules. "Ah, Potter," McGonagall said, as she noticed his arrival. "Miss Granger was just explaining your collaborative study methods. I must say, I've never seen first-year students tackle such advanced material with such systematic thoroughness." Harry set his books down carefully, trying to read the professor's tone. Hermione caught his eye and offered a small, reassuring smile that suggested this wasn't the disciplinary encounter he'd feared. "Your recent examination results have been quite remarkable, Potter," McGonagall continued. "Professor Flitwick mentioned that your charm work has improved dramatically, and even Professor Snape grudgingly admitted that your latest potions essay showed unusual insight into theoretical applications." Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks at the unexpected praise. He'd grown accustomed to Hermione's encouragement and support, but hearing that professors had noticed his improvement felt surreal. "I was curious about the methods you've been employing," McGonagall said, gesturing to their organized materials. "Miss Granger has been explaining your approach to collaborative learning and complementary skill development. It's quite sophisticated for students your age." Hermione spoke up then, her voice carrying the confidence that came from knowing she could defend their methods with solid reasoning. "We realized early on that we have different learning styles and academic strengths, Professor. Harry has exceptional intuitive understanding of practical magic, while I tend to excel at theoretical analysis. By combining our approaches, we're both able to achieve deeper comprehension than either of us could manage independently." McGonagall picked up one of their shared notebooks, flipping through pages of detailed notes that showed clear evidence of two different handwriting styles working in concert. The integration was seamless, Harry's practical observations woven together with Hermione's theoretical explanations to create comprehensive study guides that covered material from multiple angles. "This is graduate-level organizational methodology," McGonagall observed, her tone carrying genuine surprise. "Where did you learn to structure your research this way?" Hermione exchanged a quick glance with Harry before answering. "We developed it ourselves, Professor. Harry helps me understand the practical applications of theoretical concepts, while I help him see the underlying principles that govern magical effects. We've found that explaining things to each other forces us both to understand the material more completely." McGonagall set the notebook down and studied both students with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated countless Gryffindors over the years. In Harry's case, however, her expression seemed more thoughtful than stern. "I'm curious, Potter," she said directly. "How do you find this approach compared to your previous study methods?" Harry hesitated, unsure how to explain that he'd never really had study methods before meeting Hermione. His academic experience at the Dursleys had been one of deliberate sabotage, homework time interrupted by endless chores, and any sign of intellectual curiosity met with mockery or punishment. "It's different," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. "Having someone to work with makes everything clearer. When I don't understand something, Hermione can explain it in ways that make sense to me, and when she's struggling with practical application, I can show her how the magic feels from the inside." McGonagall nodded slowly, and Harry thought he detected a hint of approval in her expression. "Your partnership appears to be beneficial for both of you," she said. "Miss Granger's practical skills have improved noticeably, and Potter, your theoretical understanding has developed far beyond what I would expect from a first-year student." She paused, seeming to consider something carefully before continuing. "I want to propose something," she said finally. "Advanced study opportunity for exceptional students. Professor Flitwick and I have been discussing the possibility of offering supplementary instruction to first years who demonstrate unusual aptitude and motivation." Harry and Hermione exchanged surprised glances. The idea that they might be considered for advanced opportunities felt almost too good to be true. The program would involve additional assignments and independent research projects, McGonagall continued. More challenging material, higher expectations, and the opportunity to explore magical theory at a level typically reserved for upper-year students. "Are you interested?" "Yes," Hermione said immediately, her eyes bright with excitement. "Absolutely, Professor. We'd love the opportunity to push ourselves academically." Harry nodded his agreement, though part of him still struggled to believe that he belonged in any kind of advanced program. The boy who had been told he was stupid and worthless for 11 years was being offered opportunities that seemed far beyond his reach just months earlier. "Excellent," McGonagall said with satisfaction. "I'll arrange for you to receive supplementary materials and assignments starting next week. However," she added, her tone becoming more serious, "I want to be clear about expectations. This is not simply more homework. You'll be expected to engage with magical theory at a sophisticated level, conduct independent research, and present your findings in a scholarly manner." "We understand, Professor," Hermione replied confidently. "We're prepared to meet whatever standards you set." McGonagall gathered her robes and prepared to leave, but paused to address them both one final time. "Your partnership is unusual," she said. "Most students your age compete rather than collaborate, focus on individual achievement rather than mutual support. The academic culture you've created together is quite remarkable. After the professor departed, Harry and Hermione sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. The validation from a respected faculty member felt overwhelming, particularly for Harry, who was still adjusting to the idea that his academic abilities were worth developing. "I can't believe she noticed," Harry said finally. "I mean, I know we've been working hard, but I never thought professors would pay attention to first years like this." Hermione's expression was thoughtful as she organized their materials for the evening's work. "Harry," she said gently, "you need to start recognizing your own capabilities. Professor McGonagall wouldn't have offered us advanced opportunities if she didn't believe we could handle them. Your insights and intuitive understanding of magic are genuinely impressive." Harry ducked his head, still uncomfortable with praise, but no longer automatically rejecting it, the way he had when their partnership first began. The steady reinforcement of his worth and abilities over the past month had begun to create small cracks in the armor of self-doubt the Dursleys had built around him. They settled into their evening routine, but tonight's work felt different, charged with new possibilities and elevated expectations. Hermione had prepared an ambitious agenda that included advanced transfiguration theory, complex potions interactions, and a comparative analysis of different approaches to charms work that drew on sources far beyond their required reading. As they worked through the material together, Harry found himself marveling at how natural their collaboration had become. Hermione would present a theoretical concept, walking him through the underlying principles with patient precision. Then Harry would demonstrate the practical application, showing her how the magic felt when performed correctly, helping her understand the subtle physical and mental adjustments that made the difference between success and failure. The process was more than just academic instruction. It was a form of magical communion that neither of them had experienced before. Harry's intuitive grasp of practical magic, combined with Hermione's encyclopedic theoretical knowledge, created a synergy that elevated both of their abilities beyond what either could achieve independently. "Look at this," Hermione said excitedly, pointing to a passage in one of their advanced texts. "This describes the mathematical relationships that govern transfiguration efficiency. The author suggests that understanding these principles can improve spell accuracy by significant percentages." Harry leaned over to study the equations, his brow furrowing as he tried to parse the complex mathematical relationships. The numbers meant little to him in isolation, but when Hermione began explaining how they related to wand work and magical focus, he could feel understanding beginning to dawn. "It's like music," he said suddenly, the comparison occurring to him without conscious thought. The mathematical relationships, they create harmony or discord, depending on how well they align with the magical properties of the objects being transformed. Hermione stared at him with undisguised amazement. "That's brilliant, Harry," she breathed. "That's exactly the kind of intuitive insight that makes you such an exceptional wizard. You can see patterns and connections that most people miss entirely." Harry felt the familiar flush of pleasure at her praise, but this time it was tempered by growing confidence in his own abilities. Over the past month, Hermione's consistent recognition of his contributions had begun to convince him that maybe, just maybe, he actually was capable of the academic excellence she saw in him. They spent the next hour exploring the connections between mathematical theory and practical spellwork, with Harry providing intuitive insights that helped Hermione understand complex concepts, and Hermione offering theoretical frameworks that gave structure to Harry's instinctive magical understanding. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ron Weasley, who appeared around the corner of their section looking slightly lost and more than a little annoyed. His red hair was disheveled, and his expression suggested he'd been searching for them for some time. "There you are," Ron said, his tone carrying a mixture of relief and irritation. "I've been looking all over for you two. Seamus said you might be in the library, but I've been wandering around for 20 minutes. Harry looked up from his notes, feeling a flicker of guilt at his friend's obvious frustration. "Sorry, Ron," he said. "We're here most evenings now. Study sessions, you know." Ron's gaze swept over their table, taking in the advanced texts, detailed notes, and sophisticated organizational system they'd developed. His expression shifted from annoyance to something that looked suspiciously like resentment. "Right," Ron said slowly. "Study sessions. Every single night, apparently. Dean was wondering if you'd forgotten you had other friends." The criticism stung, partly because Harry knew there was some truth to it. His partnership with Hermione had become so absorbing, so central to his daily routine, that he'd somewhat neglected the casual friendships he'd begun to develop with his dormitory mates. "We're not trying to exclude anyone," Hermione said carefully, her diplomatic instincts engaging. "We just work well together academically. Different learning styles, you know." Ron's expression suggested he found her explanation less than satisfying. "Must be nice," he said, his tone carrying an edge that made Harry wince. "Having someone to do all your thinking for you, Harry. Makes the work a lot easier, I bet." The accusation hit Harry like a physical blow, tapping directly into his deepest insecurities about his own intellectual capabilities. For a moment, he was transported back to the Dursleys' kitchen table, listening to Vernon explain to visitors that Harry was a bit slow and needed extra help with everything. "That's not what this is," Harry said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. The old familiar doubt was creeping in, whispering that maybe Ron was right, maybe he was just coasting on Hermione's brilliance without contributing anything meaningful himself. Hermione, however, had no such doubts. Her response was swift and uncompromising. "That's completely wrong, Ron," she said, her voice sharp with indignation. "Harry contributes as much to our partnership as I do. His insights into practical magic are extraordinary, and his intuitive understanding of spell work is better than most upper-year students." Ron's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Come off it, Hermione. Everyone knows you're the brilliant one. Harry's famous, sure, but that doesn't make him some kind of academic genius." The casual dismissal of Harry's abilities, the assumption that fame was his only noteworthy characteristic, ignited something fierce and protective in Hermione's chest. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said, her voice low but carrying unmistakable authority. "Harry has been working harder than anyone else in our year, overcoming educational neglect that would have destroyed most people's academic confidence permanently. The fact that he's not only succeeded, but excelled, is a testament to his intelligence and determination." Ron took a step back, clearly surprised by the intensity of her defense. His gaze shifted between Harry and Hermione, and Harry could practically see him processing the implications of what he'd witnessed. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it," Ron said, his tone becoming more conciliatory. "I just miss hanging out with you, Harry. Feels like you've completely disappeared into your books." Harry felt torn between conflicting loyalties and emotions. Part of him appreciated Ron's desire for friendship and recognized the validity of his complaint. But another part of him, the part that had been transformed by weeks of academic success and genuine intellectual partnership, resented having to defend his commitment to learning. "The work we're doing is important, Ron," Harry said finally. "For the first time in my life, I'm actually good at something that matters. I'm not going to apologize for wanting to develop that." Ron nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he didn't entirely understand Harry's perspective. "Fair enough," he said. "Just you know, don't forget there's more to Hogwarts than studying." After Ron departed, Harry and Hermione sat in contemplative silence for several minutes. The encounter had highlighted tensions that neither of them had fully acknowledged, the social costs of their intensive academic partnership and the way their excellence might be perceived by their peers. "Are we becoming too isolated?" Harry asked finally, voicing the concern that had been gnawing at him. Maybe Ron has a point about neglecting other relationships. Hermione considered the question seriously before responding. "I think we need to be intentional about maintaining other friendships," she said. "But Harry, I don't want you to doubt the value of what we're building together. Our partnership isn't just about academic achievement, it's about supporting each other's growth and helping each other reach our potential." She reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture that had become their signal for serious conversation. "What Ron said about me doing your thinking for you, that's not just wrong, it's harmful. You have genuine intellectual gifts that exist completely independently of me. Our collaboration works because we both contribute essential elements." Harry squeezed her hand, feeling the familiar comfort of her unwavering support. "I know that intellectually," he said. "But sometimes the old doubts creep back in. When someone suggests I'm just riding on your coattails, it hits all my insecurities about not being smart enough or good enough." Hermione's expression grew fierce with protective anger. "Harry," she said firmly, "you scored higher than I did on our last Charms practical exam. Your essay on defensive magic applications earned praise from Professor McGonagall that she's never given any first-year student. Your contribution to our Transfiguration research project was so insightful that I learned things I never would have discovered on my own." She pulled out their shared notebook and flipped to a section filled with Harry's handwriting, detailed observations about magical theory that demonstrated sophisticated understanding and original thinking. "This is your work," she continued, pointing to specific passages. "Your ideas, your insights, your intellectual contributions. Anyone who suggests otherwise is either ignorant or deliberately undermining your confidence." Harry studied the pages she'd indicated, seeing his own thoughts and analysis laid out in black ink. The evidence of his intellectual growth was undeniable, but the emotional impact of having someone recognize and defend his contributions felt even more significant. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for seeing value in what I bring to our partnership, and for not letting me diminish my own contributions." "Always," Hermione replied simply. "That's what partners do. We protect each other from both external attacks and internal doubts." They returned to their evening's work with renewed focus and determination. The encounter with Ron had been unsettling, but it had also clarified something important about their friendship and academic collaboration. They weren't just study partners or casual friends, they were intellectual companions who had chosen to support each other's growth regardless of social pressure or peer expectations. As the evening progressed, and the library grew quieter around them, Harry found himself reflecting on the transformation that had occurred in his life over the past month. The frightened, isolated boy who had cried alone among the ancient runes books had been replaced by someone confident enough to engage with advanced magical theory and defend his right to academic excellence. The change wasn't just about improved grades or professor approval, though those were certainly gratifying. It was about discovering that he had intellectual capabilities worth developing, that his mind was sharp and curious and capable of sophisticated analysis when given proper support and encouragement. Most importantly, he'd learned what it felt like to have someone believe in his potential unconditionally, to have a partner who saw his struggles and chose to help rather than turning away. Hermione's friendship had given him something he'd never experienced before, the security that comes from knowing someone will stand beside you regardless of circumstances. As they packed up their materials and prepared to return to Gryffindor Tower, Harry felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey they'd undertaken together. Tomorrow night, they would return to their corner table in the library. They would continue pushing each other toward academic excellence while building the foundation of trust and mutual support that was transforming both their lives. The future stretched ahead of them, full of advanced courses and research opportunities and challenges they would face together. Harry Potter was no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The first real test of their partnership came on a grey November morning, when frost painted the castle windows in delicate crystalline patterns, and the great hall buzzed with the usual breakfast conversations. Harry was methodically working through his porridge while reviewing his potions notes when Draco Malfoy's voice cut through the ambient chatter like a blade through silk, sharp and deliberately cruel in the way that only privileged cruelty could achieve. "Well, well," Malfoy drawled from his position at the Slytherin table, his pale eyes fixed on Hermione with predatory satisfaction. "Look what we have here." The little mudblood thinks she belongs at the top table with her betters. The word hit the great hall like a physical blow, creating an immediate circle of silence around the source. Conversations died mid-sentence as students turned to stare, some with shock, others with the uncomfortable fascination that comes from witnessing deliberate cruelty. Harry felt something cold and sharp unfurl in his chest, a protective rage that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced before. Hermione had gone very still beside him, her fork suspended halfway between her plate and her mouth. The colour had drained from her face, but her expression remained carefully neutral, as if she was determined not to give Malfoy the satisfaction of seeing how deeply his words had struck. Harry knew her well enough by now to recognize the effort it took for her to maintain that composure, the way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as she processed the attack. The silence stretched for several heartbeats, pregnant with tension and the weight of unspoken responses. Around them, Harry could feel the attention of the entire Great Hall, focusing on their table, waiting to see how this confrontation would unfold. Some students looked uncomfortable with Malfoy's slur. Others seemed eager for the drama that was clearly about to erupt. Harry stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the stone floor with deliberate precision. Every eye in the hall turned toward him, and he could feel the weight of their collective expectation pressing down like a physical force. For a moment, he was transported back to all the times he'd watched the Dursleys humiliate him in front of neighbours or shopkeepers, times when he'd been too small and powerless to defend himself. This was different. He was no longer powerless, and Hermione was not someone he would allow to be attacked without consequences. "Take it back, Malfoy," Harry said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet hall. His tone was calm, conversational even, but there was something underneath it that made several nearby students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Malfoy's eyebrows rose in mock surprise, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, Potter's decided to play knight in shining armour, has he? How touching, defending your little mudblood girlfriend." The second use of the slur shattered something inside Harry's chest. The rage that had been building exploded outward, channeled through his wand before conscious thought could intervene. The hex he cast was one Hermione had taught him from an advanced defense text, and it struck Malfoy with pinpoint accuracy that spoke to weeks of intensive magical training. Malfoy's face erupted in angry red boils that pulsed and throbbed with each heartbeat. His hands flew to his cheeks as he let out a strangled cry of pain and humiliation. Around him, his Slytherin companions recoiled in shock, several of them reaching for their own wands before apparently thinking better of escalating the confrontation. The Great Hall exploded into chaos. Students jumped to their feet, some cheering Harry's retaliation, while others shouted about unfair attacks and house rivalry. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to bounce off the enchanted ceiling and amplify into something resembling a riot. Through it all, Harry remained standing beside the Gryffindor table, his wand still drawn and his gaze fixed on Malfoy with unwavering intensity. He felt no satisfaction at the other boy's pain, but he also felt no regret for causing it. Some lines could not be crossed without consequences, and attacking Hermione was definitely one of those lines. "Potter," a cold voice cut through the chaos like winter wind. Professor Snape materialized beside their table with the unsettling suddenness that had terrified generations of students. His black eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction as he surveyed the scene, taking in Malfoy's boil-covered face and Harry's still-drawn wand. 50 points from Gryffindor for unprovoked magical assault, Snape announced, his voice pitched to carry throughout the hall. "Detention for a week, and I'll be writing to your head of house about this disgraceful display of dark arts usage." Harry opened his mouth to protest, to point out that Malfoy had initiated the confrontation with his vicious slur, but Hermione's hand closed firmly around his wrist. When he glanced at her, she shook her head almost imperceptibly, her expression warning him not to make the situation worse through argument. "Professor Snape," Hermione said, rising gracefully to her feet with the kind of composure that would have impressed diplomats, "I believe you may have misunderstood the sequence of events. Mr. Malfoy used a highly offensive term that constitutes magical harassment under the Hogwarts Code of Conduct. Harry was responding to protect another student from discriminatory abuse. Snape's attention shifted to Hermione, with the slow, deliberate focus of a predator, selecting its prey. "Miss Granger," he said silkily, "are you attempting to lecture me on school policy? Perhaps you're unaware that your opinion carries considerably less weight than your inflated sense of importance suggests." The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep while maintaining plausible deniability. Around them, Harry could see students watching with uncomfortable fascination, waiting to see how Hermione would respond to being publicly diminished by a professor. Instead of shrinking back or accepting the rebuke, Hermione straightened her spine and met Snape's gaze directly. "With respect, Professor," she said clearly, "I'm citing specific sections of the student handbook regarding harassment and discrimination. Mr. Malfoy's use of blood status slurs creates a hostile educational environment that violates multiple school policies." Her voice carried the kind of calm authority that came from absolute confidence in her facts. She'd clearly memorized the relevant regulations and was prepared to deploy them with lawyerly precision. The effect was both impressive and slightly terrifying, watching an 11-year-old girl face down an intimidating professor with nothing but superior knowledge and unshakable conviction. Snape's expression darkened considerably at having his authority challenged, particularly by a Muggle-born first year who dared to cite regulations at him. The silence in the Great Hall grew oppressive as everyone waited to see how far this confrontation would escalate. The intervention came from an unexpected source. Professor McGonagall appeared beside their group with the brisk efficiency that marked all her movements, her tartan robes swirling as she assessed the situation with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "What exactly is occurring here?" she asked, her tone carrying the kind of authority that commanded immediate respect from students and colleagues alike. "Potter hexed Mr. Malfoy without provocation," Snape said smoothly, gesturing to the Slytherin boy who was still clutching his boil-covered face. "I was administering appropriate discipline when Miss Granger decided to argue with my authority." McGonagall's gaze shifted between the various participants, taking in Malfoy's condition, Harry's defensive posture, and Hermione's composed but alert expression. When she spoke, her words were measured and precise. "Mr. Malfoy," she said directly, "what did you say immediately before Mr. Potter's hex?" Malfoy's eyes darted towards Snape, clearly hoping for support or rescue. When none was forthcoming, he mumbled something inaudible while staring at the floor. "Speak clearly, Mr. Malfoy," McGonagall commanded. "The entire hall heard your initial comment. I require you to repeat it now." The demand put Malfoy in an impossible position. Repeating his slur would demonstrate that Harry's retaliation was justified, but refusing to answer would suggest guilt and evasion. He stood frozen for several seconds, trapped between equally unpalatable options. He called Hermione a mudblood, Harry said finally, his voice carrying clearly throughout the hall. "Twice. The second time after I asked him to take it back." The effect of Harry's statement was immediate and dramatic. McGonagall's expression shifted from stern inquiry to cold fury, her lips compressing into a thin line that spoke of barely controlled anger. Around the hall, students began murmuring among themselves, the consensus clearly shifting toward recognition that Harry's response had been provoked. "Mr. Malfoy," McGonagall said, her voice carrying the kind of Arctic chill that made hardened criminals confess their crimes. "You will report to my office immediately after breakfast. The use of blood status slurs constitutes harassment and discrimination, both of which carry serious disciplinary consequences." She turned toward Snape with the same implacable authority. "Professor Snape, I believe Mr. Potter's actions fall under the school's self-defense and protection of others' policies. While his methods were perhaps more dramatic than necessary, his response to discriminatory harassment was both understandable and legally justified." Snape's jaw tightened at having his authority undermined, but he could hardly argue with McGonagall's superior knowledge of school policy. The disciplinary action he'd announced hung in the air between them, clearly no longer supportable given the context that had been established. However, McGonagall continued, turning her attention back to Harry, the use of advanced hexes in the Great Hall creates safety concerns regardless of provocation. Mr. Potter, you'll serve detention with me tomorrow evening. We'll discuss appropriate responses to harassment and review proper channels for reporting discriminatory behavior. The resolution felt more fair than anything Snape would have imposed, and Harry nodded his acceptance readily. Beside him, Hermione relaxed slightly, her rigid posture softening as the immediate crisis passed. As the professors departed and normal breakfast conversations gradually resumed, Harry found himself surrounded by a mixture of congratulations and concerns from his fellow Gryffindors. Several older students clapped him on the shoulder, praising his defense of Hermione, while others worried about the attention he'd drawn from Snape and the potential consequences for their house points. Through it all, Hermione remained quietly thoughtful, her breakfast forgotten as she processed everything that had occurred. When the initial excitement died down and their housemates returned to their own concerns, she finally turned toward Harry with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. "For standing up for me, I mean. And for not backing down when Snape tried to make it your fault." Harry felt heat rise in his cheeks at her gratitude. "You don't have to thank me for that," he replied. "Nobody gets to talk to you that way. Nobody gets to make you feel like you don't belong here." Hermione's eyes grew suspiciously bright at his fierce declaration. The bond between them had been tested by public confrontation and emerged stronger for having survived the trial. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand, the gesture conveying everything that words couldn't express. The rest of the day passed in a blur of classes and conversations, with news of the morning's confrontation spreading throughout the castle with the speed that only school gossip could achieve. Harry found himself the center of attention in ways that felt both gratifying and uncomfortable, praised by some students while receiving suspicious looks from others who questioned his methods or motives. By evening, when they settled into their usual corner of the library, the events felt like they belonged to a different lifetime. The familiar routine of collaborative study provided a sense of normalcy that both of them craved after the morning's drama. "I've been thinking about what happened," Hermione said, as they organized their materials for the night's work, about how quickly everything escalated and how differently it could have gone. Harry looked up from his potions textbook, noting the serious expression that meant she'd been analyzing the situation from multiple angles. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Well," she began, settling into her chair with characteristic precision. "Your response was effective in the immediate term. Malfoy was humiliated and unlikely to repeat that particular attack anytime soon. But it also established a precedent that could have complicated consequences." She pulled out a notebook and began sketching what appeared to be a flow chart of potential responses and outcomes. "If we respond to every provocation with dramatic hexes," she continued, "we risk being seen as unstable or dangerous. That could undermine our academic credibility and social relationships." Harry frowned as he considered her analysis. "So you think I shouldn't have defended you?" he asked, a note of hurt creeping into his voice. "No," Hermione said quickly, reaching across to touch his hand reassuringly. "I'm grateful that you stood up for me, Harry. What I'm suggesting is that we need to be more strategic about how we handle these situations in the future." She flipped to a new page in her notebook and began writing what looked like a comprehensive response protocol. "We need multiple tools for dealing with harassment and discrimination," she explained. "Direct confrontation like you used today, but also formal complaint procedures, social pressure, and diplomatic solutions." Harry watched her work with a mixture of admiration and amusement. Even in the aftermath of being publicly attacked, she was approaching the problem with methodical analysis and systematic planning. It was quintessentially Hermione, turning personal trauma into an opportunity for improved preparation. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "most people would just be upset about what happened. You're treating it like a research project." Hermione looked up from her notes with a small smile. Being upset doesn't solve problems, Harry. Understanding the dynamics and developing better strategies does. Besides, she added with a hint of steel in her voice, I refuse to let people like Malfoy make me feel powerless or unwelcome. They spent the next hour developing what they somewhat jokingly referred to as their anti-harassment protocol, a comprehensive approach to dealing with discrimination and bullying that included everything from formal reporting procedures to strategic social responses. The exercise was both practical and therapeutic, transforming their anger and frustration into actionable plans. As the evening progressed, and they transitioned from crisis planning to regular academic work, Harry found himself reflecting on the day's events with a mixture of pride and concern. He'd successfully defended someone he cared about, but he'd also discovered the intensity of his own protective instincts and the potential consequences of acting on them without careful consideration. The hex he'd used on Malfoy had been both precise and devastating, drawing on weeks of intensive magical training with Hermione. The ease with which he'd accessed and deployed advanced magic was both gratifying and slightly frightening. He was becoming more powerful, more capable, but with that capability came increased responsibility for the consequences of his actions. Hermione seemed to sense his internal conflict without needing explicit discussion. As they worked through their Transfiguration homework, she made casual comments about the importance of measured responses and strategic thinking, weaving lessons about wisdom and restraint into their academic collaboration. By the time they packed up their materials and prepared to return to Gryffindor Tower, Harry felt more grounded and thoughtful about the day's events. The immediate crisis had passed, but it had revealed important truths about their partnership and the challenges they would face as they continued to grow both academically and personally. The morning's confrontation had been their first real test as a team, their first experience of facing external hostility together. They'd emerged stronger and more united, but also more aware of the complexities involved in navigating social dynamics while maintaining their commitment to each other and their shared values. As they walked through the corridors toward their common room, Harry felt a deep sense of gratitude for Hermione's presence in his life. Her analytical mind and strategic thinking provided balance to his more impulsive protective instincts, while his willingness to take action gave teeth to her careful planning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but they would face them together with improved understanding of their own capabilities and limitations. The partnership that had begun with tears in a lonely corner of the library had evolved into something powerful and transformative, tested by conflict and strengthened by mutual support. Harry Potter was learning what it meant to have someone worth fighting for, and more importantly, someone who would help him fight wisely rather than simply fighting hard. The break-in at Gringotts had been mentioned only briefly in the Daily Prophet, a small article buried between advertisements for cauldron polish and announcements of ministry appointments. Most students had skimmed past it without a second thought, their attention captured by more immediate concerns like upcoming Quidditch matches and the approach of winter holidays. But Hermione Granger was not most students, and when she noticed the date of the break-in coincided exactly with Harry's visit to Diagon Alley, her curiosity transformed into something approaching obsession. She spread the newspaper clipping across their library table like a general examining battlefield intelligence, her brown eyes bright with the kind of focused intensity that had become familiar to Harry over their months of partnership. The article was frustratingly brief, offering little more than confirmation that an attempted theft had occurred and that nothing had been taken from the vault in question. "Look at this, Harry," she said, pointing to the relevant passage with precision. July 31st. The same day Hagrid took you to Gringotts. The same day he made that mysterious stop at Vault 713. Harry leaned closer to study the newspaper, inhaling the faint scent of parchment and ink that always seemed to surround Hermione during her research phases. The coincidence was striking, but he wasn't entirely sure what conclusions they should draw from it. "You think Hagrid took something from that vault?" he asked, trying to follow her line of reasoning. something the thieves were after. "I think," Hermione said carefully, "that someone knew exactly which vault to target and exactly when it would be vulnerable. The timing is too precise to be coincidental. Someone with inside knowledge orchestrated that break-in attempt." She pulled out a fresh notebook, one of dozens she'd filled with their various research projects over the term, and began sketching what appeared to be a timeline of events. Her handwriting was neat and precise, each entry carefully dated and cross-referenced with supporting evidence. "Consider the sequence," she continued, her pen moving rapidly across the page. "On July 31st, Hagrid removes something valuable from Vault 713. That same day, someone attempts to break into that exact vault. The thieves clearly expected to find something specific, but they were too late." Harry watched her work with a mixture of admiration and growing unease. Hermione's analytical mind was formidable when focused on academic problems, but applying that same intensity to mysterious circumstances within Hogwarts itself felt more dangerous somehow. "What do you think it was?" he asked. "What could be valuable enough to warrant breaking into Gringotts?" "That's what we need to find out," Hermione replied, her expression taking on the determined look that meant she wouldn't rest until she had answers. "I've been researching historical precedents for Gringotts security breaches, and this appears to be the first successful penetration of their defenses in over a century." She flipped to another section of her notebook, revealing pages of meticulously copied information about goblin banking practices, security measures, and the legendary protections surrounding their most valuable vaults. "Whatever Hagrid retrieved, it's something extraordinary," she continued. "Something worth risking war with the Goblin Nation to obtain. The question is whether he was protecting it or delivering it to someone else." The implications of her analysis sent a chill down Harry's spine. He'd grown fond of Hagrid during their brief interactions, remembering the gentle, half-giant who had rescued him from the Dursleys and introduced him to the wizarding world. The idea that his friend might be involved in something dangerous or duplicitous felt deeply unsettling. "Maybe we should ask him directly," Harry suggested. "Hagrid's always been honest with me. If there's something I should know about what happened that day, he'd probably tell me." Hermione considered this proposal with characteristic thoroughness before shaking her head. "Not yet," she said finally. "We need more information before we approach anyone directly. If this involves something truly sensitive, asking the wrong questions could put us in danger." She pulled out another folder, this one containing what appeared to be architectural sketches and floor plans. Harry recognized some of the diagrams as representations of Hogwarts's layout, but others showed unfamiliar structures and passages. "I've been researching the castle's defensive systems," she explained, noting his curious expression. "If someone brought a valuable artifact to Hogwarts for protection, there are only a few locations secure enough to house something that important." Her finger traced a path through the castle diagrams, highlighting specific rooms and corridors. "The most likely location would be somewhere on the 3rd floor, she continued. "The corridor that's been declared off-limits to students. Professor Dumbledore's warning during the opening feast was quite specific about the consequences of going there." Harry remembered the headmaster's announcement, delivered with unusual seriousness during what should have been a celebratory welcome. The 3rd floor corridor had been placed strictly out of bounds, with threats of painful death for anyone foolish enough to ignore the prohibition. "You think whatever Hagrid took from Gringotts is hidden up there?" Harry said, the pieces of Hermione's analysis beginning to form a coherent picture. "I think it's the most logical conclusion," she replied. "Dumbledore wouldn't issue such dramatic warnings about an empty corridor. There's something up there that requires extraordinary protection, something dangerous enough to kill anyone who encounters it unprepared." She closed the architectural folder and leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "The question is, what could be so valuable and so dangerous that it requires both Gringotts-level security and Dumbledore's personal protection?" Harry found himself thinking about the stories he'd heard regarding Dumbledore's legendary accomplishments, the kind of power and influence that made him one of the most respected wizards in the world. If the headmaster was personally involved in protecting something, the stakes were likely far higher than simple theft or monetary gain. "This feels bigger than us," Harry said quietly, voicing the concern that had been growing throughout their conversation. "If Dumbledore and Gringotts are involved, maybe we should leave this alone." Hermione's expression grew stubborn, the look that appeared whenever someone suggested she abandon a research project, before reaching satisfactory conclusions. "Harry," she said firmly, "someone tried to steal something from one of the most secure locations in the wizarding world. They failed, but that doesn't mean they've given up. If that something is now hidden in our school, we have a right to know what kind of danger we're living with." Her argument was logical and compelling, but Harry still felt uneasy about the direction their investigation was taking. The comfortable world of academic collaboration and mutual support was being complicated by mysteries that seemed to involve some of the most powerful figures in the wizarding world. "What are you proposing?" he asked finally, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Research," Hermione said simply. "Systematic investigation using the resources available to us. We're not going to do anything dangerous or reckless, but we can certainly gather information and try to understand what's happening in our own school." She pulled out a fresh sheet of parchment and began outlining what appeared to be a comprehensive research plan. Different sections were labeled with topics like historical precedents, magical artifacts, security systems, and personnel analysis. "I want to research everything I can find about objects valuable enough to warrant this level of protection," she said, her pen moving rapidly as she organized her thoughts. "Legendary artifacts, powerful magical items, anything that might explain why someone would risk everything to obtain it. Meanwhile," she continued, "you could focus on gathering observational information about the third-floor corridor." "Not going there yourself," she added quickly, noting his expression, "but talking to portraits, ghosts, house elves, anyone who might have noticed unusual activity in that area." Harry studied her research plan with growing appreciation for both its thoroughness and its caution. Hermione had clearly learned from their recent confrontation with Malfoy, approaching this new challenge with strategic thinking rather than impulsive action. "What about other students?" he asked. "Have you noticed anyone else paying attention to these things?" Hermione nodded toward the main area of the library, where they could see Ron Weasley struggling with what appeared to be a potions essay. "He's asked a few questions about what we're working on," she said. "Nothing specific, but I get the impression he's curious about our research methods." Harry followed her gaze, noting Ron's frustrated expression as he wrestled with his assignment. Their friendship had grown somewhat strained since the confrontation over their study schedule, but Harry still felt fondness for his dormitory mate and occasional guilt about their decreased interaction. "Maybe we should include him," Harry suggested. "He's trustworthy, and having another perspective might be useful." Hermione considered this proposal with characteristic thoroughness. "He's certainly loyal," she said finally, "and he has insights into wizarding culture that we sometimes lack. But he's also impulsive and not particularly subtle. If we're going to involve him, it needs to be on our terms with clear boundaries about what actions are acceptable." They spent the next hour developing what they privately termed their investigation protocol, a systematic approach to gathering information while minimizing risk and avoiding detection. The plan was methodical and comprehensive, reflecting Hermione's analytical strengths while incorporating Harry's practical concerns about implementation. As evening approached and the library began to empty of other students, they transitioned from planning to initial research. Hermione had identified several promising texts about magical artifacts and historical security breaches, while Harry reviewed maps of the castle, looking for alternative approaches to gathering observational data about the third floor. The work was absorbing in the way that all their collaborative projects had become, each of them contributing unique perspectives and insights that enhanced their collective understanding. But underneath the familiar rhythm of their partnership, Harry sensed a new tension, an awareness that they were moving beyond academic exercises into something with real-world implications. "Look at this," Hermione said suddenly, her voice tight with excitement. She'd been working through a particularly dense text about legendary magical objects, and her finger now pointed to a specific passage that had clearly captured her attention. Harry leaned over to read the indicated section, which described an artifact known as the Philosopher's Stone. According to the text, the stone possessed the power to grant immortality and transform base metals into gold, making it one of the most coveted objects in magical history. Nicholas Flamel, Hermione continued reading, is the only known creator of the Philosopher's Stone. Born in 1330, he has used the stone's power to extend his life for over 6 centuries. The current location of the stone is unknown, though rumors suggest it remains under Flamel's personal protection. The implications hit Harry immediately. An object that could grant immortality would certainly be valuable enough to warrant breaking into Gringotts. It would also be dangerous enough to require the kind of dramatic warnings Dumbledore had issued about the 3rd-floor corridor. "You think that's what's hidden up there?" he said. "The Philosopher's Stone." "It fits every criterion we've established," Hermione replied, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of puzzle-solving. "Valuable enough to steal, dangerous enough to kill for, important enough to warrant Dumbledore's personal involvement." She flipped through several more pages of the text, looking for additional information about the stone's properties and history. "According to this," she continued, "Flamel has been working with Dumbledore for decades. They collaborated on alchemical research before Dumbledore became headmaster." Harry felt pieces clicking into place with almost audible precision. If Flamel and Dumbledore were partners, it made perfect sense that the stone would be moved to Hogwarts for protection when Gringotts was compromised. The school's defenses, combined with Dumbledore's personal power, would provide security that even the goblin banks couldn't match. But who would want to steal it? Harry asked. And why now, after all these centuries? "That's the question, isn't it?" Hermione said thoughtfully. "Someone powerful enough to penetrate Gringotts, desperate enough to risk everything for immortality, and bold enough to challenge Dumbledore directly." She closed the text and leaned back in her chair, her expression growing contemplative. "There aren't many wizards who fit those criteria," she continued. "It would have to be someone with significant magical power, extensive resources, and compelling reasons to risk such a dangerous theft." Harry found himself thinking about the stories he'd heard regarding dark wizards and their obsessions with power and immortality. The idea that someone like that might be targeting Hogwarts, might be threatening the school where he'd finally found safety and belonging, made his chest tight with anxiety. "What do we do with this information?" he asked. "Assuming we're right about the stone, assuming it really is hidden in the castle, what's our next step?" "We continue gathering information," Hermione said firmly. "But we also need to be more careful about our safety and the safety of other students. If someone is planning another theft attempt, this time targeting Hogwarts directly, we need to be prepared." She pulled out yet another notebook and began sketching what appeared to be emergency protocols and safety procedures. Her methodical approach to potential danger was both reassuring and slightly unsettling, evidence of how seriously she was taking the threat they might have uncovered. As they packed up their materials and prepared to return to Gryffindor Tower, Harry felt the weight of new knowledge and new responsibilities settling across his shoulders. What had begun as academic curiosity about a newspaper article had evolved into something far more significant and potentially dangerous. The comfortable world of collaborative study and mutual support was being complicated by mysteries that reached into the highest levels of wizarding society. But despite his growing unease, Harry also felt a familiar sense of determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he and Hermione would face them together with the same systematic preparation and mutual support that had served them so well in academic pursuits. Walking through the corridors toward their common room, Harry reflected on how much had changed since that first evening, when Hermione had found him crying in the library. They'd evolved from isolated individuals seeking comfort and connection into a formidable partnership capable of tackling challenges that would intimidate many older students. The investigation they were undertaking felt different from their previous projects, charged with real danger and genuine stakes. But the fundamental dynamic remained the same. Two brilliant young minds working together to understand their world and protect the things they valued most. Tomorrow would bring new research and new discoveries. They would continue building their understanding of the forces at work within Hogwarts, while maintaining the academic excellence and personal growth that had become the foundation of their friendship. Harry Potter was learning what it meant to be part of something larger than himself, a partnership built on trust and mutual support that could weather any storm. The decision to approach Professor McGonagall had not been made lightly. After 3 days of debate and careful consideration, Harry and Hermione had concluded that their discovery about the Philosopher's Stone was too significant and too dangerous to handle alone. Armed with their meticulously organized research and a carefully rehearsed presentation, they requested a private meeting with their head of house, expecting to be praised for their diligence and immediately brought into whatever protective measures were already in place. Instead, they found themselves sitting in McGonagall's office like chastened children while she delivered a lecture about the dangers of imagination and the importance of focusing on age-appropriate concerns. "Mr. Potter, Miss Granger," McGonagall said with the kind of measured patience typically reserved for explaining basic concepts to particularly slow students, "I appreciate your concern for the school's security. However, I must stress that Hogwarts has extensive protective measures in place, administered by qualified professionals who do not require assistance from first-year students." Harry shifted uncomfortably in his chair, feeling the weight of their carefully prepared research folders sitting uselessly in his lap. They'd spent hours organizing their findings, cross-referencing sources, and building what they believed was an airtight case for the presence of the Philosopher's Stone within the castle. Instead of validation, they were receiving dismissal. "Professor," Hermione said carefully, her voice carrying the respectful but persistent tone she used when challenging authority figures, "we understand that school security is not typically a student concern. However, our research has uncovered specific connections between the Gringotts break-in and recent events at Hogwarts that suggest a coordinated threat." McGonagall's expression remained unmoved by Hermione's diplomatic approach. "Miss Granger," she replied with crisp efficiency, "your academic abilities are exceptional, and your dedication to research is commendable. However, there is a significant difference between academic investigation and real-world security concerns. The matters you believe you've uncovered are being handled by individuals with far more experience and authority than first-year students possess." The implicit condescension in her words stung more sharply than direct criticism might have. Harry could feel Hermione's frustration radiating from the chair beside him, her careful composure beginning to crack under the weight of professional dismissal. "But Professor," Harry said, finding his voice despite his growing discomfort, "what if someone is planning another theft attempt? What if students are in danger and don't know it?" McGonagall's gaze shifted to him with laser-like intensity, and for a moment Harry was reminded uncomfortably of the way Snape looked at students who dared to question his methods. "Mr. Potter," she said firmly, "your fame does not qualify you to make assessments about threats to this institution. Hogwarts has survived for over 1,000 years by relying on experienced educators and trained security professionals, not on the speculations of children who mistake curiosity for competence." The words hit Harry like a physical blow, striking directly at his deepest insecurities about his own worth and capabilities. For a moment, he was transported back to Privet Drive, listening to Vernon explain to neighbours that Harry was a troubled child with delusions of importance who needed constant supervision. Harry's hands clenched into fists in his lap, but before he could formulate a response, Hermione was speaking again, her voice sharp with barely controlled anger. "Professor McGonagall," she said, with crystalline precision, "with respect, your dismissal of our concerns appears to be based on our age rather than the quality of our research. We have documented evidence linking the Gringotts break-in to specific security vulnerabilities within the castle. Dismissing that evidence without examination seems inconsistent with the logical analysis that Hogwarts presumably values. The challenge was delivered with surgical politeness, but its implications were unmistakable. McGonagall's eyebrows rose slightly, and Harry could practically see her deciding whether Hermione's comment constituted simple persistence or actual insubordination. "Miss Granger," McGonagall said after a long pause, "your academic achievements do not grant you authority over security matters that extend far beyond your understanding. The protection of this school requires coordination between the Ministry of Magic, the Board of Governors, and the professional staff. Your homework, however thorough, does not qualify you to participate in those discussions." Harry watched Hermione's face cycle through a series of emotions, from indignation to hurt, to something approaching rage. The casual dismissal of weeks of careful research, the implication that their concerns were merely childish fantasies, was clearly more than she could accept with diplomatic grace. "I see," Hermione said finally, her voice carrying an edge that made Harry glance at her with concern. "So our role as students is to remain ignorant of potential threats to our safety, while trusting that adults will protect us adequately, regardless of whether those adults have access to the same information we've uncovered." The comment was dangerously close to open disrespect, and McGonagall's expression grew noticeably cooler in response. "Your role as students," she replied with authoritative finality, "is to focus on your education and leave security concerns to those qualified to handle them. I will not have first years wandering the castle looking for mysteries to solve, or imagining themselves capable of protecting the school from threats that exist primarily in adventure stories." She stood up from behind her desk, clearly signaling that the meeting was over. "I trust you'll return your attention to your studies and abandon these flights of fancy. If you have legitimate concerns about school safety, you may report them through proper channels, rather than conducting unauthorized investigations." Harry and Hermione left McGonagall's office in stunned silence, their research folders still unopened, and their concerns thoroughly dismissed. As they walked through the corridors toward the library, neither spoke, both processing the unexpected failure of what they'd expected to be a straightforward consultation with a trusted authority figure. It wasn't until they reached their usual corner table that Hermione finally gave voice to the frustration that had been building throughout the encounter. "She didn't even look at our research," Hermione said, her voice tight with controlled anger. 3 weeks of systematic investigation, documented evidence, logical analysis, and she dismissed it all without examination, because we're 11 years old. Harry nodded glumly, still stinging from McGonagall's casual dismissal of his concerns, and the implications that his fame had somehow corrupted his judgment. The professor he'd begun to respect and trust had reduced their carefully considered conclusions to childish attention-seeking. "What bothers me most," Harry said quietly, "is that she's probably right about our age and experience. Maybe we are just kids playing at being detectives. Maybe the adults do know better." Hermione turned to stare at him with an expression of fierce disagreement. "Harry Potter," she said firmly, "age doesn't invalidate facts. Our research is sound, our conclusions are logical, and our concerns are legitimate. The fact that Professor McGonagall chose to dismiss us based on our age rather than examining our evidence says more about her limitations than ours." Harry wanted to believe her, but the encounter had shaken his confidence in ways that went beyond their immediate investigation. If they couldn't convince even their own head of house to take their concerns seriously, what chance did they have of protecting themselves or other students from potential threats? "Maybe we should drop it," he said reluctantly. "Focus on our studies like she suggested, and trust that the adults have everything under control." Hermione was quiet for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly on the table as she stared at their unused research materials. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a determination that was both inspiring and slightly frightening. "Harry," she said slowly, "what if she's wrong? What if the adults don't have everything under control? What if dismissing our concerns because of our age means missing something important that could put people in danger?" She pulled out their folder on the Philosopher's Stone and opened it to a page covered with her neat handwriting. Everything we've discovered still makes sense, she continued. The timeline, the connections, the logical progression from the Gringotts break-in to protective measures at Hogwarts. McGonagall's dismissal doesn't change the facts. Harry studied the research spread across their table, the careful documentation and logical analysis that represented weeks of intensive work. The evidence was compelling, regardless of their age or McGonagall's skepticism. "So what are you suggesting?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I'm suggesting that we continue our investigation," Hermione replied with quiet resolve. "Not because we don't trust adults, or because we think we're more capable than trained professionals, but because we've uncovered information that appears to be relevant to our safety and the safety of our fellow students." She flipped to a new section of their research, pages dedicated to analyzing security vulnerabilities and potential response strategies. "We'll be more careful, more systematic, and more focused on gathering information rather than taking action," she continued. "But abandoning our investigation based on one dismissive conversation seems premature." Harry felt torn between relief that they wouldn't be giving up their work and concern about the potential consequences of continuing without adult support. The encounter with McGonagall had made clear that they were truly on their own in this matter. "What if we're wrong?" he asked. "What if we're creating problems where none exist and putting ourselves in danger for nothing?" "Then we'll learn something valuable about the difference between speculation and reality," Hermione replied pragmatically. "But Harry, what if we're right and someone is planning to steal the Philosopher's Stone? What if students get hurt because we ignored evidence that could have helped prevent an attack?" The possibility she'd raised struck at Harry's deepest fears about failing to protect people he cared about. The idea that his inaction could lead to harm befalling his fellow students, particularly Hermione herself, was far more frightening than the risks involved in continuing their investigation. "All right," he said finally. "We continue researching. But carefully, like you said. No unnecessary risks, no confronting anyone directly until we have more complete information." Hermione nodded with satisfaction, already pulling out fresh parchment to update their investigation protocols. "We'll focus on observational research and information gathering," she said, "talking to portraits and ghosts, monitoring the third-floor corridor from a safe distance, researching additional protective measures that might be in place." As they worked to refine their approach, Harry found himself reflecting on the broader implications of their situation. They were operating without adult guidance or support, forced to rely entirely on their own judgment and capabilities. It was both terrifying and oddly liberating, a recognition that they possessed genuine agency and could take meaningful action to protect themselves and others. The evening progressed with renewed focus and determination. They reorganized their existing research, identified gaps in their knowledge that needed to be addressed, and developed more sophisticated methods for gathering information without attracting attention. Their conversation eventually turned to the philosophical questions that their investigation had raised, complex issues about authority, responsibility, and the ethics of taking action when adults refuse to listen. "Do you think we're being arrogant?" Hermione asked during a break in their planning, "challenging authority figures who have decades more experience than we do?" Harry considered the question carefully before responding. "I think we're being responsible," he said finally. "We found evidence of potential danger. We tried to report it through proper channels, and when that failed, we chose to continue gathering information rather than ignoring the threat." He gestured to their research materials, the careful documentation and logical analysis that represented their best efforts to understand a complex situation. "This isn't about thinking we're smarter than adults," he continued. "It's about recognizing that adults can make mistakes too, especially when they dismiss concerns without examining the evidence." Hermione nodded thoughtfully, clearly finding comfort in his analysis. "I keep thinking about what you went through with the Dursleys," she said quietly. "How many adults failed to protect you because they trusted other adults to handle the situation properly. The comparison struck Harry with uncomfortable accuracy. His situation with the Dursleys had persisted for years, partly because adults in positions of authority had assumed that other adults were handling his welfare appropriately. Teachers, neighbours, social workers, all of them had seen signs of problems, but deferred to someone else's supposed expertise. "Maybe that's part of why this bothers me so much," Harry said slowly. "The assumption that adults always know best, and children should never question their judgment. Sometimes adults are wrong, and sometimes children can see things that adults miss." Hermione reached across the table and squeezed his hand, offering the comfort and support that had become central to their friendship. "We're not trying to replace adult judgment," she said gently. "We're trying to supplement it with our own observations and analysis. If we discover something genuinely dangerous, we'll find ways to ensure that information reaches people who can act on it effectively." By the time they packed up their materials and prepared to return to Gryffindor Tower, they'd established a renewed sense of purpose and direction. The encounter with McGonagall had been disappointing and somewhat demoralizing, but it had also clarified their commitment to each other and their shared responsibility for their own safety. Walking through the corridors toward their common room, Harry reflected on how much their relationship had evolved since that first evening in the library. They'd progressed from individuals seeking comfort and connection to partners capable of challenging authority and taking independent action when necessary. The investigation they were pursuing felt different now, charged with additional significance by their recognition that they were truly operating independently. But the fundamental dynamic remained the same. Two brilliant minds working together to understand their world and protect the things they valued most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new discoveries. They would continue building their understanding of the forces at work within Hogwarts while maintaining the mutual support and collaborative excellence that had become the foundation of their partnership. Harry Potter was learning what it meant to think for himself and trust his own judgment, even when adults dismissed his concerns. More importantly, he was learning what it meant to have someone beside him who would support that independence and share the risks that came with it. The decision to investigate the third-floor corridor had crystallized over several weeks of careful observation and strategic planning. After their dismissal by Professor McGonagall, Harry and Hermione had committed themselves to a methodical approach that prioritized information gathering over direct confrontation. They'd spent countless hours interviewing portraits, consulting with ghosts, and analyzing the castle's architectural patterns to understand what protections might be guarding the Philosopher's Stone. Their breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Nearly headless Nick, when approached with carefully casual questions about unusual magical protections within the castle, had mentioned overhearing Professor Flitwick discussing complex enchantment work on the third floor. The ghost's casual observation had provided the final piece of evidence they needed to confirm their theory about the stone's location and the sophisticated defenses surrounding it. Now, as they stood in the shadows of a side corridor on the third floor, Harry felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that had accompanied all their major investigations. This was different from their previous research, which had been conducted safely within the library's familiar confines. Tonight, they were venturing into genuinely dangerous territory, with only their wits and careful preparation to protect them. The corridor stretched before them like a challenge, dimly lit by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows across ancient stone walls. The very air seemed to thrum with protective magic, raising the fine hairs on Harry's arms and creating a sense of electric tension that made his magical core respond with instinctive wariness. "Remember the plan," Hermione whispered beside him, her voice barely audible even in the profound silence of the deserted corridor. "We observe, we document, we retreat if we encounter anything beyond our capabilities. No heroics, no unnecessary risks." Harry nodded, appreciating both her caution and her willingness to undertake this investigation, despite the obvious dangers. Their partnership had evolved to include shared risk assessment and mutual protection, each of them committed to ensuring the other's safety while pursuing their common goals. They moved forward with careful deliberation, their footsteps muffled by the soft-soled shoes they'd chosen specifically for stealth. Every few meters they paused to listen, to observe, to assess their surroundings for signs of magical protections or potential threats. The door at the corridor's end was exactly as they'd expected from their research, massive and imposing, crafted from dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it. Ancient iron hinges and elaborate lock mechanisms suggested both age and formidable security, while the faint magical emanations Harry could sense spoke of enchantments far beyond first-year understanding. "Look at the lock," Hermione breathed, pointing to the complex mechanism that secured the door, multiple layers of magical and mechanical protections. "This isn't designed to keep out casual intruders, it's meant to stop determined professionals." Harry studied the door with growing appreciation for the sophistication of the defenses they were attempting to circumvent. The lock alone represented magical craftsmanship at the highest level, while the door itself radiated protective spells that made his skin tingle with proximity. "Can you open it?" he asked quietly, knowing that Hermione had been researching unlocking charms with characteristic thoroughness. "I think so," she replied with careful confidence. "But Harry, once we open this door, we're committed. Whatever's beyond it, we'll have to face together." Her words carried weight beyond their immediate situation, encompassing the broader partnership they'd built and the trust they'd developed over months of collaborative work. Opening this door represented a threshold not just into physical danger, but into a level of independence and self-reliance that would fundamentally change their relationship with the adult world. Together, Harry said simply, the word carrying all the commitment and mutual support that had become central to their friendship. Hermione drew her wand with steady hands, the magical focus gleaming in the torchlight as she began the complex series of incantations required to bypass the door's protections. Her wand work was precise and confident, reflecting weeks of practice and study that had prepared her for exactly this moment. The lock responded with a series of clicks and whirs, mechanical components shifting as magical barriers dissolved under her careful manipulation. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the corridor's silence, and both students froze momentarily, listening for any indication that their activities had attracted unwanted attention. When no immediate response materialized, Hermione completed the unlocking sequence with a final, precise flick of her wand. The door swung open with ominous creaking, revealing a darkness beyond that seemed to swallow their wand light. The smell hit them first, a combination of animal musk and something indefinably wild that made Harry's nostrils flare with instinctive alarm. As they stepped carefully across the threshold, their illumination spells revealed a chamber far larger than the corridor outside, with vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadow above. And there, occupying most of the available floor space, was the largest dog Harry had ever seen. The creature was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, easily the size of a small elephant, with 3 massive heads that swayed independently as it regarded the intruders with 6 intelligent, hostile eyes. Its coat was midnight black, and each head bore teeth that gleamed white and sharp in their wand light. "Fluffy," Hermione breathed, and Harry could hear both awe and terror in her voice. "It has to be Fluffy, Hagrid's 3-headed dog." The revelation that this was Hagrid's pet provided some measure of comfort, but not enough to diminish the very real danger they faced. Even a domesticated 3-headed dog was capable of killing 2 first-year students without breaking stride, and this particular specimen looked far from domesticated at the moment. "What's that sound?" Harry whispered, noticing a melodic quality to the air that seemed to emanate from beneath the massive creature. Hermione tilted her head, listening with the focused attention that characterized all her analytical processes. "Music," she said with growing excitement. "There's music playing from somewhere underneath Fluffy. Harry, I think the dog is guarding a trapdoor." The implications were immediately clear to both of them. If Fluffy was positioned over a trapdoor, And if that trapdoor led to additional protections for the Philosopher's Stone, then they were looking at the first layer of what was undoubtedly a sophisticated security system. "Look at how it's positioned," Hermione continued, her fear giving way to intellectual fascination. "The dog isn't just randomly placed, it's specifically guarding that spot on the floor. There's definitely something beneath it." Harry studied Fluffy's positioning with growing appreciation for the defensive strategy. The massive dog covered the entire central portion of the chamber floor, making it impossible to approach the presumed trapdoor without dealing with the creature first. "How do we get past it?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer based on their research into magical creature behavior. "Music," Hermione replied with confidence. "Three-headed dogs are known to be susceptible to musical enchantment. If we can produce the right kind of melody, we should be able to lull it to sleep long enough to investigate what it's guarding." The plan was simple in concept, but challenging in execution. Neither of them was particularly musical, and creating the kind of sustained melody required to enchant a creature of Fluffy's size would require both skill and endurance. "I have an idea," Harry said, remembering a spell he'd seen Hermione practicing from their advanced charms texts. "What about that humming charm you've been working on? The one that creates sustained musical tones?" Hermione's expression brightened with understanding and approval. "That could work," she said thoughtfully. "The Cantus Continuous charm is designed for exactly this kind of application. If I can modulate the pitch and rhythm properly, it should produce the hypnotic effect we need." She spent several minutes reviewing the incantation under her breath, ensuring she had both the wand work and the magical theory correct before attempting to enchant a creature capable of eating them both. Harry watched her preparation with admiration, noting the careful attention to detail that had become characteristic of all her magical work. "Ready," she said finally, raising her wand toward the massive dog. The charm she cast was both beautiful and eerie, producing a melodic humming that seemed to fill the chamber with soothing harmonies. The effect on Fluffy was immediate and dramatic, all three heads swaying in rhythm with the music, as the creature's hostile alertness gradually gave way to drowsy contentment. Within minutes, all 6 eyes had closed, and the massive dog settled onto the floor with earth-shaking thuds that reverberated through the stone chamber. Deep, rhythmic breathing replaced the earlier growls and snarls, confirming that their musical enchantment had achieved the desired effect. "Now," Hermione whispered, maintaining the charm while gesturing toward the area Fluffy had been guarding. Harry moved carefully around the sleeping creature, noting the enormous paws and massive heads that could crush him even in sleep. Sure enough, beneath Fluffy's previous position was a wooden trapdoor set flush with the stone floor, its surface marked with additional magical protections that glowed faintly in their wand light. "It's here," he called softly to Hermione. "The trapdoor, and it looks like there are more enchantments on it." "Keep the music going," she replied, her concentration evident in the steady rhythm she maintained. "Can you open it without dispelling the other protections?" Harry examined the trapdoor's surface with careful attention, noting the complexity of the magical work that secured it. Unlike the door they'd bypassed to enter the chamber, these protections seemed designed more for detection than prevention, as if they were meant to alert someone when the trapdoor was opened, rather than preventing access entirely. "I think so," he said, drawing his own wand and beginning the careful process of disabling the detection charms. The protections are sophisticated, but they're not meant to be impenetrable. More like an early warning system. His analysis proved correct as he worked through the magical locks and alert spells, each one yielding to careful manipulation that avoided triggering the notification enchantments. The work required intense concentration and precise wand work, but his months of advanced study with Hermione had prepared him for exactly this kind of challenge. "Got it," he said finally, as the trapdoor's protections dissolved under his touch. The wooden panel swung open silently, revealing a dark shaft that descended into the depths of the castle. "What do you see?" Hermione asked, maintaining her musical charm while trying to peer past Fluffy's massive form. Harry moved to the edge of the opening and directed his wand light into the darkness below. "A shaft, maybe 20 feet deep," he reported. "It looks like it opens into another chamber, but I can't see much from here." The decision to continue deeper into the protective system wasn't made lightly. They'd already ventured far beyond their original plan of simple observation, and each additional step took them further from safety and deeper into unknown dangers. But the opportunity to understand the full scope of the protection surrounding the Philosopher's Stone was too valuable to abandon. If someone was planning to steal the artifact, knowledge of these defenses could prove crucial to preventing that theft or protecting other students from the consequences. "We go down," Hermione said with determination, though Harry could hear the apprehension beneath her resolve. "But carefully, and with clear communication about what we're encountering." Harry nodded his agreement, appreciating both her courage and her insistence on maintaining their safety protocols, even in increasingly dangerous circumstances. They'd come too far to retreat now, but they could still proceed with the systematic caution that had served them well throughout their investigation. The descent through the trapdoor required careful coordination, with Hermione maintaining her musical charm until Harry was safely at the bottom of the shaft, then following while he provided illumination and watch for additional dangers. The process took several minutes of precise magical work, but eventually both students stood together in the chamber below. The space they'd entered was unlike anything in the castle's normal architecture, clearly created specifically to house whatever protection lay within. The walls were smooth stone, unmarked by age or decoration, while the floor was covered with something that rustled softly under their feet. "Plants," Hermione observed, directing her wand light toward the ground. "The entire floor is covered with some kind of vegetation." Harry knelt to examine the plant matter more closely, noting the thick, rope-like vines that seemed to shift subtly, even in the absence of wind. "Devil's snare," he said with growing alarm, remembering descriptions from their herbology texts. "It's devil's snare, and it's already starting to react to our presence." The vines around their feet had begun to move with definite purpose, reaching up toward their legs with the kind of slow, inexorable motion that spoke of predatory plant behavior. Devil's Snare was known for strangling its victims slowly, tightening its grip as they struggled until they suffocated or were crushed. "Light and heat," Hermione said quickly, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Devil's Snare retreats from bright light and fire. We need to create both, immediately." Both students raised their wands simultaneously, Harry casting the strongest illumination charm he could manage, while Hermione produced a controlled flame that danced above her palm. The effect on the Devil's Snare was immediate and dramatic, the attacking vines recoiling from both the light and heat as the plant mass pulled back toward the chamber's shadowed corners. Working together, they created a corridor of safety through the hostile vegetation, their combined magical efforts forcing the Devil's Snare to retreat far enough to allow safe passage to the chamber's exit. The coordination required intense concentration from both of them, but their months of collaborative magical work had prepared them for exactly this kind of partnership under pressure. The next chamber beyond the Devil's Snare presented an entirely different challenge. As their wand light illuminated the space, they discovered a room filled with flying objects that glittered and darted through the air like a swarm of angry insects. Keys, Harry realized, watching the aerial display with growing understanding. Flying keys, and that door at the far end must require a specific one to open. Hermione studied the swarm with analytical precision, noting the different sizes, shapes, and flight patterns of the enchanted keys. "There must be hundreds of them," she observed, "and only one will fit the lock. We need to identify which key corresponds to that door and capture it somehow." The challenge was both magical and physical, requiring them to outmaneuver flying objects that had been specifically enchanted to avoid capture while identifying the correct key from among dozens of similar alternatives. "Look at the lock," Harry suggested, directing his wand light toward the door they needed to open. "If we can see what kind of key it requires, we might be able to identify the right one from the swarm. Their examination of the lock revealed it to be an antique design, requiring a large, ornate key with distinctive metalwork. Scanning the flying swarm, they were able to identify several candidates, but one particular key stood out for its size and the way it seemed to fly with slightly less vigor than its companions. "That one," Hermione said, pointing to a large silver key that bore obvious signs of recent use. "It's flying lower than the others, and look at its wing. There's definitely some damage there." Capturing a flying key required strategy, timing, and coordinated magical work. They spent several minutes developing a plan that involved herding the target key toward one corner of the room while using stunning spells and binding charms to immobilize it long enough for capture. The execution required perfect timing and seamless cooperation, but their partnership had been forged through months of collaborative challenges that had prepared them for exactly this kind of coordinated magical work. Within minutes, they had successfully captured the correct key and opened the door to the next chamber. Each successive room presented new challenges that tested different aspects of their magical education and partnership. A giant chess set required strategic thinking and precise piece movement, with the enchanted pieces responding to commands but demanding tactical expertise that drew on both students' analytical capabilities. The chess game was particularly challenging because it required them to risk themselves as living pieces, taking positions on the board and directing the magical game pieces through a complex series of moves and countermoves. The stakes were real, with captured pieces being destroyed rather than simply removed from play. But their months of collaborative problem-solving had prepared them for exactly this kind of intellectual challenge. Hermione's strategic thinking combined with Harry's intuitive understanding of magical dynamics allowed them to navigate the chess puzzle successfully, though not without several close calls that left both of them shaken. By the time they reached the final chamber, both students were exhausted from hours of intensive magical work and high-stress problem-solving. But they were also exhilarated by their success in overcoming challenges that would have defeated many older students. The last room was different from all the others, smaller and more intimate, with a large mirror dominating one wall and a sense of profound magical significance that made Harry's scar prickle with uncomfortable recognition. "The Mirror of Erised," Hermione breathed, recognizing the artifact from their advanced reading. "Harry, this mirror shows the deepest desires of whoever looks into it. But why would it be part of the stone's protection?" Harry approached the mirror with careful steps, aware that magical artifacts of this power often carried unexpected consequences for the unwary. His reflection appeared normal at first, but as he continued looking, the image began to change, showing him something that made his breath catch in his throat. In the mirror, he saw himself standing exactly where he was. But he wasn't alone. Behind his reflection stood two figures he recognized from photographs, but had never seen in life. His parents, James and Lily Potter, their faces glowing with pride and love as they watched their son. But there was something else in the mirror, something his reflection was holding that wasn't in his actual hands. A red stone, smooth and gleaming, that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "Hermione," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "I think I know how this protection works. The mirror shows you what you want most, but it also shows you how to get it." She moved to stand beside him, studying both his reflection and the stone it held. "The Philosopher's Stone," she said with wonder. "The mirror is showing you the stone because that's what you need right now. What would help you protect everyone you care about." As Harry continued to gaze into the mirror, he felt a strange sensation, as if something was moving in his pocket. When he reached down to investigate, his fingers closed around something small and solid and warm that definitely hadn't been there moments before. He pulled out the object and stared at it in amazement. The Philosopher's Stone, exactly as it had appeared in the mirror, lay in his palm like a captured star. "It worked," he said in wonder. Somehow, wanting to protect people instead of wanting to use the stone myself, that made the mirror give it to me. Hermione stared at the stone with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "Harry," she said carefully, "we've just acquired one of the most powerful magical artifacts in existence. We need to be very careful about what we do next." Before either of them could say more, they heard footsteps in the corridor beyond, approaching their chamber with purposeful strides. Someone else had followed their path through the protections, and Harry had a sinking feeling he knew exactly who it would be. The footsteps approaching their chamber carried a quality that made Harry's scar burn with sudden, sharp pain. He pressed his palm against his forehead, the Philosopher's Stone still clutched in his other hand, as waves of malevolent magic washed over him with increasing intensity. Beside him, Hermione had gone very still, her wand raised, and her expression alert with the kind of focused readiness that meant she was prepared for immediate action. The figure that entered the mirror chamber was not the one Harry had expected. Instead of Snape's familiar black robes and sneering expression, they faced Professor Quirrell, his usual nervous demeanor replaced by something cold and purposeful that transformed his entire appearance. The stammering, frightened teacher they knew from Defense Against the Dark Arts classes had vanished, revealing someone entirely different underneath. "Well, well," Quirrell said, his voice carrying none of its usual hesitation or uncertainty. "Harry Potter and his clever little mudblood friend. How delightfully unexpected to find you here ahead of me." Harry felt rage flare in his chest at the slur, but Hermione's hand on his arm kept him from responding immediately. Her touch was both restraining and reassuring, a reminder that they needed to assess the situation carefully before taking action. "Professor Quirrell," Hermione said with diplomatic caution, though Harry could hear the steel beneath her polite tone. "We were investigating reports of unusual magical activity in this area. Perhaps you could explain what you're doing here." Quirrell's laugh was harsh and completely unlike the nervous giggling they'd grown accustomed to in his classroom. "Oh, my dear Miss Granger," he replied with mock courtesy, always so eager to understand everything around you. "I'm here for the same reason you are, though I suspect my motivations are considerably more honest than yours." Harry shifted slightly, positioning himself so that he could shield Hermione if necessary, while keeping the Philosopher's Stone concealed in his closed fist. The artifact felt warm against his palm, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat. "What do you mean?" Harry asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer, based on the malevolent magic radiating from their defense professor. "I mean, Potter, that I've been working all year to reach this chamber and claim what rightfully belongs to my master," Quirrell replied, his transformation from nervous teacher to confident servant now complete. The break-in at Gringotts, the various attempts to bypass Hogwarts' security, the careful monitoring of student activities, all of it leading to this moment. He gestured toward the mirror of Erised with casual familiarity, as if he'd been studying it for months, rather than encountering it for the first time. "The mirror will show me how to obtain the Philosopher's Stone," he continued with certainty, "and then my master will have the power he needs to return to his full strength and reclaim his rightful place as the most powerful wizard who ever lived." Harry's scar was now burning with such intensity that he could barely think clearly, waves of pain washing over him in rhythm with whatever dark magic Quirrell was channeling. But through the agony, he began to understand something important about their situation. "Your master," Harry said through gritted teeth. "You're talking about Voldemort." The name hit the chamber like a physical force, causing Quirrell to recoil slightly, while the mirror's surface rippled as if disturbed by the sound. Hermione's grip on Harry's arm tightened, and he could feel her magical energy rising as she prepared for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Do not speak that name," Quirrell hissed, his composure cracking for the first time since entering the chamber. "My master has transcended such limitations. He is beyond names, beyond death, beyond the petty concerns that constrain lesser wizards." But as Quirrell moved toward the mirror, Harry noticed something crucial. The professor's reflection appeared normal, showing him exactly as he stood in the chamber. There was no stone in his reflected hands, no indication that the mirror was revealing the secret of obtaining the Philosopher's Stone. It's not working, Harry realized aloud, understanding flooding through him despite the pain in his scar. The mirror isn't showing you how to get the stone because you want to use it, not protect it. Quirrell's expression grew ugly with frustration and rising anger. Impossible, he snarled. The mirror must reveal the stone's location. My master's research indicated that this final protection could be bypassed through proper application of desire and will. He began pacing in front of the mirror, trying different approaches and viewing angles, but his reflection remained stubbornly unchanged. The mirror showed him exactly what he was, a servant seeking power for his master, but it offered no guidance about obtaining the artifact he desperately needed. Meanwhile, Harry could feel the stone growing warmer in his concealed hand, as if it was responding to the presence of someone who meant to misuse its power. The artifact seemed almost alive, pulsing with protective magic that resonated with his own magical core. Perhaps, Hermione said carefully, her voice carrying the diplomatic tone she used when navigating dangerous conversations, the mirror requires a different approach. Maybe it responds to specific types of desires or intentions. Quirrell's attention snapped to her with predatory focus. You know something, he accused. Both of you have been researching this protection system, haven't you? Your investigation into the Gringotts break-in, your questions about castle security, your evening meetings in the library, all of it was preparation for this moment. The accusation was partially accurate, but it missed the crucial element of their motivation. They hadn't been planning to steal the stone. They'd been trying to protect it, and the school from whoever was attempting the theft. We were trying to understand what was happening, Harry said honestly. We knew someone was after something valuable, and we wanted to make sure students would be safe. How noble, Quirrell sneered. How perfectly Gryffindor of you both. But nobility won't protect you from what's about to happen. My master grows impatient, and he demands results regardless of the obstacles in our path. As Quirrell spoke, Harry began to sense something else in the chamber, a presence that felt cold and alien and utterly malevolent. The pain in his scar intensified dramatically, and he realized with growing horror that Voldemort wasn't just Quirrell's distant master. He was here, somehow sharing the professor's body. Let me speak to them, a voice hissed from somewhere that seemed to be both everywhere and nowhere at once. The voice was thin and cold, and filled with a hatred so pure it made Harry's magical core recoil in instinctive terror. Quirrell's hands moved to the back of his head, unwinding the turban he always wore with trembling fingers. As the fabric fell away, Harry and Hermione both gasped in horror at what was revealed. On the back of Quirrell's head was another face, pale and serpentine, with red eyes that burned with malevolent intelligence. It was barely human, more like a grotesque parody of human features, but the power radiating from it was unmistakably that of the most dangerous dark wizard who had ever lived. Harry Potter, the face said, and its voice was the same cold whisper they'd heard moments before. How interesting to meet you at last. You have something that belongs to me, I think. The direct address from Voldemort sent shock waves of pain through Harry's scar, but it also triggered something else, a protective response that seemed to emanate from deep within his magical core. The warmth he'd always associated with thoughts of his parents flared to life, creating a barrier between himself and the dark magic pressing against his consciousness. I don't have anything of yours, Harry said through gritted teeth, the lie coming easily despite the agony in his head. We came here to investigate, not to steal anything. Voldemort's laugh was like ice breaking, sharp and brittle and utterly without warmth. Your occlumency skills need work, child, he said, with casual cruelty. I can see the stone's presence burning in your mind like a beacon. You have it, and you will give it to me, or watch your little friend die slowly and painfully. The threat against Hermione galvanized Harry in ways that personal danger never could. The protective instincts that had driven him to hex Malfoy for using a slur exploded into something far more powerful, a fierce determination to shield someone he loved from harm, regardless of the cost to himself. "Never," Harry said with absolute conviction, the word carrying more magical weight than any spell he'd ever cast. Beside him, Hermione raised her wand with steady hands, her fear evident, but completely overwhelmed by her own protective determination. "Whatever happens, Harry," she said quietly, "we face it together. That was our promise from the beginning." Her words reminded him of that first night in the library, when she'd sworn never to leave his side, and the memory strengthened his resolve in ways that surprised him. This wasn't just about protecting the Philosopher's Stone or preventing Voldemort's return. It was about honoring the partnership that had transformed both their lives. "How touching," Voldemort sneered. "Love and friendship against the greatest wizard who ever lived. Let me show you how little such sentiment matters when confronted with true power." Quirrell raised his wand, but before he could cast whatever curse Voldemort had commanded, Harry acted on instinct, honed by months of collaborative magical work with Hermione. Instead of trying to attack or defend individually, he reached for her hand, joining their magical cause in the way they'd learned to do during their most challenging study sessions. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The warmth Harry had felt when thinking about his parents expanded to encompass both of them, creating a barrier of protective magic that made Quirrell stagger backward with a cry of pain and surprise. "What is this?" Voldemort hissed, his red eyes narrowing as he studied the magical phenomenon surrounding the two students. "This is not possible. Love magic cannot be shared between the living." But clearly it could, because the protective barrier continued to strengthen as Harry and Hermione maintained their connection. The magic felt familiar and foreign simultaneously, drawing on the same deep well of mutual care and commitment that had powered their friendship from its earliest days. Quirrell attempted to approach them again, but contact with the protective barrier caused his hands to blister and smoke, as if he'd grasped red-hot metal. He screamed in agony and staggered away, leaving Voldemort's face contorted with rage and frustrated hunger. "You cannot maintain this protection forever," Voldemort snarled. "Eventually you will tire, and when you do, I will take what I came for and destroy everything you hold dear." "Maybe we can't maintain it forever," Hermione said, with quiet strength. "But we don't have to. We just have to maintain it long enough for help to arrive or for you to realize that some things are more important than power." Her words carried the same analytical precision she brought to all their academic work, but now applied to a life-or-death situation that required both intellectual clarity and emotional courage. She was thinking strategically, even in the face of the most dangerous dark wizard in history. Harry felt the Philosopher's Stone pulse in his hand, its rhythm synchronizing with their shared magical protection. An idea began to form in his mind, dangerous and uncertain, but potentially their only chance of ending this confrontation safely. "The stone," he said to Hermione without taking his eyes off Voldemort. "I think it's responding to our protection magic. What if we could use it somehow, not to grant immortality, but to strengthen what we're already doing?" Hermione's understanding was immediate and complete, her brilliant mind grasping the implications of his suggestion instantly. "The stone amplifies magical effects," she said, with growing excitement. "If we channel our protection through it, we might be able to create something Voldemort can't counter or overcome." The Dark Wizard's eyes blazed with sudden alarm as he realized what they were contemplating. "No," he hissed with desperate fury. "The stone belongs to me. I will not be denied by children playing with magic they don't understand." Quirrell lunged toward them with reckless desperation, but the moment he made contact with their enhanced protective barrier, his entire body began to smoke and crumble. The combination of love magic, friendship bonds, and the Philosopher's Stone's amplification created a force that dark magic simply couldn't withstand. Voldemort's screams of rage and agony echoed through the chamber as Quirrell's body disintegrated under the assault of protective magic. The parasitic spirit was forced to abandon his host, fleeing the chamber as a wisp of black smoke that dissipated into nothingness, when it encountered the magical barriers surrounding Hogwarts. In the sudden silence that followed Voldemort's departure, Harry and Hermione remained connected, their magical cores still joined in the protective matrix that had saved both their lives. The Philosopher's Stone continued to pulse in Harry's hand, its power now somehow integrated with their friendship in ways that neither of them fully understood. "It's over," Hermione said quietly, though she made no move to break their magical connection. "He's gone, at least for now." Harry nodded, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated by what they'd accomplished together. The partnership that had begun with tears and promises had evolved into something capable of defeating one of the most dangerous threats in the wizarding world. "What do we do with this?" he asked, holding up the Philosopher's Stone. "It's too powerful to leave lying around, but I don't think we should give it back to Dumbledore either." Hermione considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "We keep it safe," she said finally. "Together, the way we've kept each other safe. And we use it not for immortality or gold, but to protect the people we care about." The decision felt right in ways that Harry couldn't fully articulate. They'd proven themselves capable of wielding the stone's power responsibly, using it to enhance protection rather than seeking personal gain. More importantly, they'd proven that their partnership could handle challenges that would defeat individual wizards far older and more experienced than themselves. As they made their way back through the protective chambers, past the sleeping Fluffy, and up through the trapdoor, Harry reflected on how much had changed since that first evening in the library. They'd evolved from lonely, isolated students into partners capable of facing down the darkest threats the wizarding world could produce. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and opportunities they could barely imagine. But whatever came next, they would face it together, armed with the kind of trust and mutual support that could overcome any obstacle. Harry Potter was no longer the frightened, abandoned boy who had cried alone among ancient books. He was part of something larger and stronger than himself, a partnership that had been tested by the ultimate darkness and emerged victorious. The hospital wing had never felt more like a sanctuary than it did in the hours following their confrontation with Voldemort. Harry lay in one of the pristine white beds, the Philosopher's Stone hidden beneath his pillow, where only he and Hermione knew of its location, while Madame Pomfrey bustled around them with the kind of fierce protectiveness that reminded him uncomfortably of how the Dursleys should have cared for him, but never had. Hermione occupied the bed beside his, despite the matron's initial protests that she was perfectly healthy and didn't require overnight observation. It had taken considerable diplomatic skill and a few carefully placed tears before Pomfrey had relented, allowing them to remain together during their recovery from what the school was being told was a gas leak incident in the dungeons. The official story was laughably inadequate, but it served the dual purpose of explaining their injuries while avoiding panic among the student body. Harry suspected that Dumbledore had crafted the cover story personally, though the headmaster had yet to visit them directly. "You're thinking too loudly," Hermione murmured from her adjacent bed, her voice carrying the familiar mixture of concern and gentle teasing that had become one of his favorite sounds in the world. "I can practically hear your mind racing from here." Harry turned his head to look at her, noting the way afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows highlighted the determined set of her jaw and the intelligence that sparkled in her brown eyes even when she was supposedly resting. "Just processing everything that happened," he replied quietly, conscious of the fact that Madame Pomfrey was still within earshot, even if she was currently occupied with organizing her supply cabinets. The confrontation with Quirrell and Voldemort felt simultaneously like something from a vivid nightmare and the most real experience of his 11 years of life. The magical connection they'd forged during the battle had left both of them with an enhanced awareness of each other's emotional states, a side effect that was both comforting and occasionally overwhelming. Harry could sense Hermione's lingering anxiety about the Philosopher's Stone's presence and her determination to research the long-term implications of what they'd experienced. "We need to talk about what happens next," Hermione said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The stone, our enhanced magical connection, the fact that Voldemort will certainly make another attempt to return, all of it requires careful planning and preparation. Harry nodded, appreciating both her methodical approach to crisis management and her unwillingness to pretend that defeating Voldemort once meant their troubles were over. The Dark Wizard had fled when his host body was destroyed, but parasitic spirits didn't simply give up and disappear permanently. "What are you most worried about?" he asked, sensing the complex mixture of concerns that were occupying her brilliant mind. Hermione was quiet for a moment, clearly organizing her thoughts with characteristic precision, before responding. "The magical bond we created," she said finally. "Harry, what we did down there, combining our magical cores and channeling protection through the stone, that's not something that just fades away. We've fundamentally altered our magical signatures in ways that could have consequences we don't yet understand." Harry felt a flutter of anxiety at her words, but it was quickly overwhelmed by a deeper sense of rightness about their connection. Whatever changes had occurred as a result of their shared magical working, they felt like natural extensions of the partnership they'd been building since that first night in the library. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly, voicing a fear he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "The bond, I mean." "The way we're connected now," Hermione's response was immediate and emphatic. "Never," she said with fierce conviction. "Harry, what we have now is the most precious thing in my life. I can feel your emotional state, sense when you're in distress or danger, know with absolute certainty that someone in this world cares about my well-being as much as I care about theirs." She paused, seeming to gather courage for something particularly significant. "What worries me isn't the bond itself," she continued, "but the responsibility that comes with it. We're connected in ways that go beyond normal friendship now. That means we have obligations to each other that extend far beyond what most people our age would understand or accept." Harry considered her words carefully, recognizing the weight of what she was describing. Their magical connection meant they would be able to sense each other's distress across great distances, share magical energy during times of crisis, and coordinate their abilities in ways that individual wizards simply couldn't achieve. "I think I'm okay with that kind of responsibility," he said finally. "Actually, I think I want it. For the first time in my life, I have someone who chose to be connected to me. Someone who decided I was worth making that kind of commitment to." Hermione's smile in response was radiant, transforming her entire face and filling Harry with a warmth that had nothing to do with magical bonds and everything to do with genuine affection and mutual understanding. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Professor Dumbledore, whose presence seemed to fill the hospital wing with the kind of magical weight that made the air itself feel denser. The headmaster's blue eyes, usually twinkling with benevolent amusement, were serious as he approached their beds. "Mr. Potter, Miss Granger," Dumbledore said, with formal courtesy that suggested this was more than a casual check on their recovery. "I trust you're both feeling better after your ordeal." Harry exchanged a quick glance with Hermione, both of them instantly alert despite their supposed need for rest. Dumbledore's tone carried undertones that suggested he knew considerably more about their recent activities than the official gas leak story would account for. "We're recovering well, Professor," Hermione replied with diplomatic caution. "Thank you for your concern." Dumbledore nodded approvingly, then conjured 2 comfortable chairs that he positioned between their beds before settling himself with the unhurried movements of someone prepared for a lengthy conversation. "I believe," the headmaster said carefully, "that we have several matters to discuss regarding recent events within the castle. Perhaps we might begin with your understanding of what occurred in the 3rd-floor corridor." The direct question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Harry could feel Hermione's analytical mind working through possible responses, weighing the risks and benefits of different levels of honesty with the most powerful wizard in Britain. "Professor," Harry said finally, we discovered that someone was attempting to steal the Philosopher's Stone. When we realized that adult authorities either couldn't or wouldn't take our concerns seriously, we decided to investigate the threat ourselves. Dumbledore's eyebrows rose slightly at Harry's blunt summary of their motivations. An interesting interpretation of events, he said thoughtfully. And what did you discover during this investigation? We discovered that Professor Quirrell was serving as a host for Voldemort, Hermione said, with clinical precision. We confronted them in the mirror chamber, prevented the theft of the stone, and used its power to enhance our protective magic sufficiently to force Voldemort's spirit to flee. The headmaster was quiet for several long moments, his blue eyes studying both students with the kind of penetrating attention that made Harry feel as though his thoughts were being read directly from his mind. A remarkable achievement for 2 first-year students, Dumbledore said finally. Might I inquire about the current location of the Philosopher's Stone? Harry felt the artifact's warm presence beneath his pillow, pulsing gently in rhythm with his heartbeat. The question he'd been dreading had finally been asked directly, and he wasn't sure how to respond without lying to the most accomplished legilimens in the wizarding world. Professor, Hermione said carefully, before we discuss the stone's location, we'd like to understand why it was brought to Hogwarts in the first place, and why the protections around it failed to prevent the infiltration we discovered. Dumbledore's expression grew thoughtful at her diplomatic deflection. A fair question, Miss Granger, he replied. The stone was moved to Hogwarts because Gringotts's security had been compromised. As for the protections failing, I'm curious about your assessment of their effectiveness. They worked exactly as designed, Harry realized aloud, understanding flooding through him as he considered the sequence of events. The protections weren't meant to stop someone from reaching the stone. They were meant to test them. You wanted to see if the person trying to steal it was worthy of possessing it. Dumbledore's eyes began to twinkle with something approaching approval. An astute observation, Mr. Potter, he said. The protections were indeed designed to evaluate the character and capabilities of anyone who managed to reach the final chamber. And the Mirror of Erist was the ultimate test, Hermione added, her voice growing excited as she worked through the logic. It would only give the stone to someone who wanted to protect it, rather than use it. Someone motivated by love and sacrifice, rather than personal gain. Precisely, Dumbledore confirmed, which brings us back to my original question about the stone's current location. I trust it remains safe. Harry hesitated, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. Professor, he said slowly, the stone is safe, but I don't think it should be returned to Nicholas Flamel, and I don't think it should remain at Hogwarts, where it could attract more threats. Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Indeed, he said mildly. And what would you propose as an alternative? Hermione reached across the space between their beds to take Harry's hand, their enhanced magical connection, allowing them to share thoughts and intentions with unprecedented clarity. We propose that we keep it, she said with quiet determination. Not to use for immortality or wealth, but as a focus for the protective magic we've learned to create together. The stone responded to our combined intentions in ways that suggest it recognizes our partnership as worthy of its power. The headmaster was silent for nearly a full minute, his blue eyes moving between the 2 students as if he was weighing possibilities they couldn't even imagine. A most unusual proposal, he said finally. The Philosopher's Stone is not a toy or a school project, Mr. Potter, Miss Granger. It represents power that has corrupted wizards far older and more experienced than yourselves. With respect, Professor, Harry said, finding courage in Hermione's unwavering support. We've already been tested by that power. We used it to save lives and protect others, not to benefit ourselves. If age and experience were the only qualifications that mattered, then Quirrell would have been a better guardian than we proved to be. Dumbledore's expression grew contemplative at Harry's challenge. You raise a valid point, he acknowledged. Experience and age do not automatically confer wisdom or moral character. Your actions in the mirror chamber certainly demonstrated both courage and selflessness. He stood up from his chair and began pacing slowly between their beds, his long robes rustling with each measured step. The room filled with the kind of magical tension that suggested the headmaster was making a decision of enormous significance. "Very well," Dumbledore said finally, stopping to face them both directly. "I will allow you to retain custody of the Philosopher's Stone, under several conditions that are absolutely non-negotiable." Harry felt a surge of excitement and apprehension at the unexpected victory, while beside him, Hermione's analytical mind was already working through the implications and potential complications. "First," the headmaster continued, "your possession of the stone must remain absolutely secret. No other students, no other faculty members, no family members or outside contacts may be informed of this arrangement. The knowledge stays between the three of us until further notice." "We understand," Hermione said immediately. "Secrecy is essential for everyone's safety." "Second," Dumbledore continued, "you will submit to regular monitoring of your magical development and psychological state. The stone's influence on young minds is not well documented, and we must ensure that its presence doesn't corrupt your judgment or moral character." "That seems reasonable," Harry agreed, though he wondered what form such monitoring would take. "Third, and most importantly, the stone may never be used for personal benefit," he said, with absolute seriousness. "No life extension, no wealth creation, no magical enhancement beyond the protective applications you've already discovered. Any violation of this restriction will result in immediate confiscation and severe consequences." Harry and Hermione exchanged glances, both understanding the weight of what they were agreeing to accept. "We agree to all your conditions, Professor," Hermione said formally. "We understand the responsibility we're accepting, and we're prepared to honor the trust you're placing in us." Dumbledore nodded with satisfaction, then moved toward the door of the hospital wing. "One final matter," he said, turning back to face them. "Your enhanced magical connection is drawing considerable attention from various parties who monitor such phenomena. I suggest you practice discretion in how openly you display your bonded abilities." After the headmaster departed, Harry and Hermione lay in contemplative silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. They were now the secret guardians of one of the most powerful magical artifacts in existence, trusted with responsibilities that would intimidate adult wizards. "Are we insane?" Harry asked eventually, voicing the question that had been growing in his mind throughout their conversation with Dumbledore. Two 11-year-old students agreeing to guard the Philosopher's Stone. "Probably," Hermione replied with a small laugh. "But Harry, insane or not, we're the ones who proved capable of using its power responsibly. We're the ones who faced down Voldemort and emerged victorious. Maybe age and experience matter less than character and intention." Harry squeezed her hand, feeling the warm pulse of their magical connection and the steady presence of the stone beneath his pillow. The future stretched ahead of them, full of challenges and dangers they could barely imagine, but they would face them together with resources and capabilities that most wizards could only dream of possessing. The partnership that had begun with tears and promises in a corner of the library had evolved into something that could reshape the wizarding world. They were no longer just students learning magic. They were guardians of ancient power and protectors of everyone they held dear. Tomorrow would bring new lessons and new discoveries as they learned to integrate their enhanced abilities with their continued education. But tonight, they would rest in the security of knowing that they had each other and the means to protect what mattered most. Harry Potter was no longer the abandoned boy who had never known love or support. He was part of something larger and more powerful than individual magic, a bonded partnership that had been tested by the ultimate darkness and proven worthy of the most precious trust in the magical world.